Everybody, and welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by Trainer Road. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and we have our head coach, Chad Timmerman, with us.
Hi, everybody.
And our CEO, Nate Pearson, is out, our normal co-host that we have. So we have a very special return guest, Cannondale's Amber Pierce. How's it going?
Hi, everybody. It's going really well. Thanks.
Good to have you back.
It's great to be here.
People were threatening to just stop listening and punch whatever they were listening on when you weren't on after having you on for 2 weeks.
Dangerous having you on.
Yes.
You set a higher standard.
Yeah, and then when we did it 2 weeks in a row, then we got people habituated, and then we just pulled the addiction away, pulled the coffee away from, you know what I mean? So it's good to have you back, though. What's new? What's new with you?
Man, a lot. So I'll say this transition out of full-time racing is a little bit weird, but but it's
I
great.
bet.
And for the record, it's actually really fun to be on this side of it. So been turning my attention to a lot of charity and outreach events.
Sweet.
I do run a small nonprofit, and we do a lot of women's-specific clinics. So we organize a really awesome gravel clinic out in Vermont this year. So hoping to do some more of that, which is really cool. And one of the things I haven't talked a lot about is that last year I ended up having a really bad concussion from my crash at Dirty Kansas. And it's been a really interesting learning process about concussion because for several weeks, actually, I didn't think that I could possibly have a concussion because I hadn't hit my head. But apparently, when you hit hard enough, your brain is just this solid mass floating around in fluid in your skull, and it can smack into the inside of your skull and cause concussion. So
And you don't have to have that hard, jarring impact, right?
yeah, when I crashed, I hit the deck really hard, but I jumped up, said, I don't think I hit my head. I checked my helmet, thought, I'm fine. Kept racing for another 100 miles. It was probably shock.
Yeah, that carried you through. Yeah.
But it's been really frustrating on the one hand, being the person that's going through it, but also there's that part of me that's just really fascinated by the whole process. So it's been a really interesting learning process. Progress is not linear, as with a lot of injuries. So it's been a good exercise in patience. But really, I mean, honestly, I'm lucky. There's nothing that isn't going to resolve. So, but yeah, it's been a very interesting journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, I feel like it almost makes it innocuous calling it a concussion. They should call it brain trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, call it something more serious so people
Yes.
take it more seriously because it is kind of a big deal.
It's a good point, and it's like such a large umbrella to cast over a lot of different things that could have gone on.
Yeah.
And we're just now maybe getting to the point where we're scratching the surface to understanding, brain trauma
few years,
a bit more on this level, rather than when brain trauma has some sort of like very clear visual impedance, like we can see that something's gone on. It's kind of like we had this very, very vague separation where it was like brain trauma like that, or you probably hit your head.
It's just a concussion.
It's just a concussion, yeah. And man, it's it's a totally different deal. And very good point on bringing up the fact that you don't have to hit your head. And I think a lot of people are like, if you cracked your helmet, you probably got a concussion. Like we kind of tie in a lot of these like if this then that for concussions because of our lack of knowledge about how to diagnose one and what actually, what sort of force is required. But we really, I think, have to take the step back and just err on the side of caution. And like Nate, when Nate crashed in Chico and broke his collarbone and everything else, he went and actually saw like a head trauma specialist, and they went through the whole process, and he had a concussion. He hit his head. So it may have been easier for him to assume that.
Right.
But there have been other times when there have been hard crashes here in the office of different folks, and he's always been like, go see this person, even if you didn't hit your head, go
I've
see
been
this person.
slammed up against the wall on the Tour de Nicoturium.
Yeah.
And it was all shoulder inside of body, but I know I sustained a minor concussion from that because I had effects from it in the weeks after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really, going to see a specialist is really important too. One of the things I've learned is that they have identified multiple systems that are affected by the trauma. So in the past, what they used to do is say, just rest. But now what they're saying is actually you want to challenge the specific symptoms that were affected. And the quicker you can start challenging them with different types of therapies, the faster you can recover and the better you can recover.
Nutrition actually plays a surprisingly big part in it as well.
Huge. Yeah. It's great. It's been a really fun learning curve in the sense of I get to learn stuff, which I always love.
Yeah.
But it's just from a personal level, it's been just interesting and frustrating. But nonetheless, I'm grateful that I have the care that I have, and that it's going to be okay. So
I'm sure people will jump in on the forum, and you can just search for episode 220. It's this one, and that's forum.trainerroad.com. I'm sure people will ask you, Amber, for like specific things about the process that you've gone through and everything else. And one final thing on that is it's so important to go see a head trauma specialist because of things like that. Right. And there's so much misinformation out there that if you try to search to find your way through this one, you're going to get lost in the web. It's just hard to find a lot of good information. There are certain things where I feel like Google is amazing and you can replace like any doctor. Like it's pretty cool. But concussions, it isn't one of them because the lack of information in itself is a story in itself. And that's, so you just get caught up in layers of,
and the specificity of it, because there are multiple systems that can be affected, and there's no formula for if you hit your head this way, the system's going to be affected. It's very individual.
They're always different.
Right. And I remember when I went to see my GP initially, because I was coming up with some wacky ideas for what was causing my symptoms, because I thought, well, it can't be concussion. And he just looked at me and he said, it's concussion. We're going to send you to this guy. And I said, well, how long do you think this is going to take? And he said, I've had people come in from severe car accidents and be better in a week. And I've had people that like bonked their head on the cabinet and took months, so there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it. So it really, really helps to go see a specialist and figure out exactly what's going on with you, what systems that you really need to be training. And
yeah. Good tips, Amber.
Sound recommendations.
Yeah. We're going to get into a lot of the questions that you guys have submitted. Firstly, though, just coming back from Eurobike, thank you to everybody that we got to meet there at Eurobike. That was really cool. Two specific shout outs that I wanted to do to Team Standard. I believe that's how you'd say it. I know you guys would say it much better over in Germany, but a pretty cool crit racing team from over there that have 1x aluminum bikes. So very similar to Cliff, which is pretty cool. And they rip it up over there. That was good to talk to them, Trainer Road users. And also just like a personal fanboy thing, I really like what Joe and the crew over at Bike Radar do. They do like a lot of like in-depth kind of putting themselves through something, and then they video document the whole thing, and then they share their learning. So like, for example, they do like hill climb TT season in the UK, or they'll have some sort of challenge on different sort of bikes, that sort of stuff. And I've gleaned a ton of benefit from their stuff. So if you haven't, you should check it out. Bike Radar, it's their channel and their website. But it's cool to get to meet them for a little bit. And they're big podcast listeners, and they were driving down from the UK to Germany listening to the podcast the whole time. So it's cool. And then plenty of people have asked, like, what was the coolest thing you saw at Eurobike? And honestly, it was basically like an e-bike show. And then everybody listening to this, we already did a podcast with DC Rainmaker last weekend. If you didn't listen to that, you should. And we talked more about the training side of things. But just as a quick aside, one cool thing that I did see, Evoque has a new, or Evoque, forgive me, has a new bike bag. And that bike bag, I think it's called like their race bike bag, something like that. And it's a road bike bag, specifically for road bikes. You could use, if you don't have a really big frame size, you could also use a TT bike. But all you have to do is take your wheels off. That's it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then you just pack your bike in.
I almost don't want you to talk about this because the demand's going to be so
So
great.
high.
I'm afraid we're not going to get one in time for Kona.
Yeah.
And if I have to take my bike apart again.
Yeah. This podcast is not sponsored, but you're welcome, Evoque. like right there. But the interesting thing about that is the fact that it's like there are soft cases, which semi-soft cases down below, but then up top it's like a hard case, and it's kind of shaped like a hammerhead shark from above.
Cool.
So you can leave. I think they had a 58, but I know in the pictures they have like a 61 centimeter Venge. And the Venge that we all three of us, Nate, Chad, and I, we have the new one. And then you ride for Cannondale, they have the System 6. These like more aero bikes that are getting more integrated, and the cable lengths are actually getting shorter because the cable lengths are like following a shorter path. So it's really tough to take your handlebars off or your stem off and have everything pack in neatly a lot of the time.
Yeah, you're going to make your mechanic really, really angry.
Yes, or break your frame because things are mashed against, but this is cool because you just leave it on, and it's a hard case up top. So, and I bet they had 44 centimeter or 46 centimeter wide road bars. They looked really wide.
Awesome.
And it was
C-mass
fitting.
was all the way up.
This one, because it was such a big frame, was down. If you ride a smaller frame size, you may not even need to drop your seat.
Pedals on, derailleur on.
Pedals on, derailleur on. Don't have to worry about it. So
That's
pretty
fantastic.
neat.
So cool.
I know that's like a first world problem of the nth degree. I mean, that's like probably the peak of all. But because you're talking about how am I going to fly with my bicycle?
Bringing our fancy bikes to Kona.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. But yeah, so it's a first world problem. But for those that suffer such afflictions, it's definitely nice to see. So. Then getting into a couple things really quick, and I'm glad we have you here on this. First of all, on the race analysis side of things, if you don't know, you should head over to youtube.com/trainerroad because you can check out these videos we'll talk about here in just a sec, but also you can join us live on the podcast. So you can see us waving right now. You could even see me standing up.
There it is.
Showing off my Leadville belt buckle. It's belt buckle day. Finally arrived. You could join us and it'd be tons of fun. Yep, that's it. Brandon is too. Wearing the shirt. We got the jacket, the whole thing.
Such a good
I
look.
don't have one.
Yeah, it's not yet.
Not yet.
Do you think you'll do it?
Highly unlikely.
Okay, yeah. So we have up there on the YouTube channel. Good call. Richie Rude, we did an analysis series. We talked about this previously. And man, more people need to see this. It's awesome. It's a seriously good series. There are so many takeaways that we get from listening to how Richie Rude sees a course. And for road biking, it's still extremely helpful, not just for mountain biking. Really cool stuff. But then we also posted a video that's called How to Attack and Hurt the Field.
Yeah.
And this was one where basically it was like if you had one of those little like counter things, that you're like pressing your thumb and clicking over and counting, you'd run through a lot, counting all the attacks that we had in this criterium. And we basically, if you've ever back in the day used the website Hot or Not, Pete basically did hot or not for all of my attacks, and most of them were not. So there were plenty of learning opportunities.
Way to review it, though.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah. It was fun. So basically, it's just a concentrated section of a bunch of attacks in a race, and we break down each one and why it was good or bad. So it's like really, really good learnings. Amber, you've raced a handful of road races in your life, a ton of them.
A few.
So in your opinion, what makes an attack a good attack? Because that was kind of the premise we were going for with that one.
Yeah, so I think, it's a lot of it's contextual because a good attack is one that achieves its purpose.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different reasons that you might want to attack. It's not always necessarily to create a separation. So often it would be the case that we were trying to set up a specific person to go. So I might attack up the left side, but I would attack in a way that I'm actually intending and trying to drag the field with me, because as I go up the left side and I pull the whole field up the left, it creates space on the right for a teammate to go encounter. So sometimes it's just about trying to open the door for somebody. You're not, so there are a lot of different reasons.
That was interesting that you mentioned working for a teammate, because that's something that a lot of the time, like somebody's like, if your attack didn't get you up the road, then it was useless and you should not attack.
No,
but you've had like such a different perspective because you've raced as like a domestique supporting a lot of riders for so long.
Right.
That's cool. Like it shows the fact that, there are plenty of other reasons that one might want to attack, to draw the field out, distract them, do anything like that.
I remember when I very first started racing, I was racing for Palo Alto Bicycles, and I had the really wonderful luck of being in this club team where most of the women on the team were already 1s and 2s, and I was like 3, I think, when I joined, and so we were racing together, and I remember going to a crit where they wanted to set me up for the win, and I was amped, so I was like, okay, tell me when to go, and they're like, no, little one, they're like, we're going to attack first, and they just attacked the berserk out of the field, and then finally they were like, okay, now you can go.
Now you can do it.
So then, okay, and then I went, and then of course by that time they'd really softened the field up for me. So no one could go with me, and it was
sweet.
Great. So it's super fun when you can do stuff like that, and when you're the teammate that's doing it for somebody else, it's honestly it's as fun, or sometimes in some cases even more fun than even being the person who wins, to know that you had that hand in it.
Yeah, I'm looking. So, and for those that don't know, a little inside baseball, we always work off of like a doc here that we come together and we prep on and everything else. And one of the things that you have on the notes here that I really like is the fact that like some attacks are just for gathering info.
Yes.
Like it's almost like a depth charge. You're like, who's coming?
Those are super fun, especially if you're not the one initiating an attack and you just get to sit back and watch what happens.
Oh yeah.
So even if you don't have teammates, this is a really useful tactic, because if you're interested in going in a break, it's to your advantage to know who else wants to go in a break, because chances are you don't necessarily want to go up the road alone. So sometimes doing a little fake attack, you'll see, who's actually coming with me, who looks motivated, who's going to actually work this with me. You can watch the same thing when someone else attacks, who's going with them, who's being marked, who seems interested in getting up the road. And then, if nothing's stuck yet, you can kind of ride past that person, give them a little look, and go, and then there's a higher chance that they're going to come with you. So that's one way of gathering information. Another one, and I have a funny story about this. I did a local crit a few years ago. It was a super windy day, and it was a situation where I think there were a couple riders in the field that I really wanted to watch. Knew they were strong. My goal on the day was to get a good TT workout, so I really wanted to go up the road. So I had to figure out how I could, and these two were really strong sprinters, so I didn't want to bring them with me. So I had to figure out if it was reasonable for me to try to go up the road solo. So I was really patient. I waited for each of them to get antsy, because sometimes it's a local race and it's not going that fast. So if you're patient enough, someone's going to go. So I waited for the first one to go, and as she's just drilling it into the wind, I literally just slotted out to the side into the wind and glanced at my power meter. And what it told me was that's at least how much power I would need to do off the front by myself to sustain a break. Slot back in. Okay, now I know that number. Patient, patient, patient. Next one attacks. Slot out in the wind. Okay. So now I know exactly what power I need to put out in order to keep them from catching me, and I know it's doable. So we come through the start-finish again where there was a serious crosswind. Speaking of a good time to attack, my goal was to get away solo. So I attacked in a place where I knew no one could get a draft. So I just slammed it into the gutter, went berserk.
You got like your lateral distance, not just, vertical in front of them, but, lateral like that.
Actually, in this case, we had such a strong crosswind that just by going into the gutter, I knew nobody could get no one could get a draft off me. So I came up from the back, and then as soon as I was off the front, I just put it in the gutter really hard, and I just threw down for 500 meters. And then we turned into the wind, and I knew, because I had done my homework looking at what power output I needed to do, and I just stuck to the numbers and stayed off front.
There we go.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways that you can sneakily gather information about what you need to know to be successful in
That's awesome.
employing a strategy. The other way that could have played out is I could have looked at the numbers on the power meter and said, you know what? This is going to be too high a power output for me to sustain. I'm better off staying in the field and then maybe bringing somebody with me and then trying to drop them later. So it can kind of inform your tactical approach in a race.
Yeah, smart. That's clever.
That's good stuff.
Good racing. Yeah. A couple other things on this too, and you'll see this in the video that we have, that it's not just about power every time.
Yes.
A lot of the time it just comes down to positioning, and positioning is always relative to the field, right? So it's really like the people you're around, and then their relative fatigue and everything else like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't even matter that you have a bunch of power, right? And you can still attack with less.
I think power is honestly usually secondary to timing and position. And, going when everybody's really tired, going when there's something about the course that's really intimidating people, so mentally they're kind of checked out or they're afraid of what's coming next. There's a lot of ways that you can kind of use people's mental state to your advantage. But yeah, timing, the element of surprise is really important. So if you're attacking off the front and everybody sees you initiate, they have plenty of time to respond. But if you're attacking from the side, and by the time they realize you're attacking, you're already at full speed once you enter their peripheral vision. Even if they respond right away, there's a time lag between, you're already at top speed, they have to get up to speed, and that gives you an advantage. So the timing is really, really key. And the timing really comes down to position too, because you have to put yourself in a position to attack from the right place in the field, and you want to attack again.
And you get used to exploiting your strengths too. If you know you're a good bike handler and you're heading into a technical section, that's a great place to attack, because a lot of people are not going to go with that. If you're someone who's willing to suffer more than other people, and you've recognized this over time, you can be that guy who just rolls off with another, an extra 50 watts because everyone else is dragging. And you just exploit that moment because I can hurt for another 30 seconds. I can do this. And that's definitely enough to open up a gap. And a lot of the times, then you just hang in there.
Yeah.
Ideally, you're not by yourself. Sometimes you are. So you have to be willing to commit to the solo effort.
Right.
But just knowing that I'm willing to hurt more than the rest of these people greatly increases my chances of making a break stick.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even about suffering or hurting more. It's also just I can hurt just a little bit longer than everybody else wants to.
Yep.
Like you don't necessarily have to sustain that power. You just have to sustain it long enough
Absolutely.
to discourage everybody
it's like
else
pushing
to
over the
give
top
it up.
of a climb.
Yeah. So it's almost like a little game of chicken.
Yeah, it is. Who's going to give up first, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically like, it's interesting when you think about that with cycling in general. Very rarely, I think, do we actually push ourselves to a true like exhaustion point where we have nothing left. Much more often, and Pete's talked about this on the podcast before, but much more often it's just because we decide to pull the plug. We decide where enough is enough. And I think that physically we could probably keep going a little more. And retroactively think of it. If you had told yourself, or you had known with a surety that in that moment that they're just going to keep going for 10 more seconds at this pace, then after that it's actually going to get easier. You would have been like, yeah, I can do it. You know, but because we don't know when it will stop.
It's almost always a conscious decision, though. I mean, between consciousness and subconsciousness, that gray area, it's pushed way, way, way towards subconsciousness. I mean, I agree. How do you get yourself to a point where you actually physically start to break down? I mean, it's a rare circumstance. It can be done for sure.
Yeah, that's and along those lines, thinking of like, you know, the subconscious things working with you. That's what you're just trying to pose that tipping point to everybody else.
Right, exactly.
If you're in the driver's seat, right?
Yeah.
You're just and like you said, you may do that by repeatedly attacking, or you may do that by just waiting for the right moment to attack.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a great quote. Kate Bates, an amazing Australian cyclist. She was racing when the early part of my career, but I remember racing with her one time, and she said this, and it stuck with me always. She's like, the moment that you think you're dying, you're actually very, 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 very far from death.
Yeah, you really are.
And sometimes if you just have that like little reality check, like, oh yeah, actually, you know.
we all know Bubba, and he used to say, "You're not going to die."
No.
He would just simplify it.
A local
You're not
racer.
going to die.
You're not going to die.
Yeah.
You're right. It hurts so bad, though.
Yeah, that's a good one. And the other side of things too, when you're looking at like I guess, so let's say that you are at the tipping point where you want to create an attack, or you want to attack, and you want to pose that scenario where a person has to choose if they quit or not. I think like the key thing is like separation is going to discourage people. And it doesn't take much distance, right?
No.
Like
Often not. Yeah.
It's surprising, and that sort of thing. You know, clearly getting out of sight definitely puts you out of mind and out of reach for a person. But when you're talking about like creating separation like that, what are the things that you look for, or what are like the key points, I guess, Amber, when you're really talking about like creating separation?
Surprise is a big one, and then you just generally you want to go when no one can follow you. And there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't be able to follow you. So there are times when, for example, the course narrows, and so it would be really difficult for somebody to come around you, or you know, so if you're at a narrow part of the course and there are people across the front that don't look like they're necessarily interested in going, and you squeeze out the side and go for an attack, then even people who want to go are stuck behind the roadblock. And I actually run one stage of the Tour de Nez like this one year up at North Star. The finish, we came up through the village, and there was this really narrow chicane going into the finish line. And so when I was inspecting the course, I was looking at that. I mean, it was over 300 meters from the line, so it wasn't exactly where you'd want to start a sprint. But when I looked at the chicane, I just thought, this is way too narrow and technical for anybody to make up position here. So essentially, in my mind, that turned the finish line into the entrance to the chicane, because I knew if you're first to the chicane, no one can come around you, even if they're stronger. So I attacked and did my full gas 100% commitment sprint into the chicane. And literally, you know, I died 1,000 deaths trying to hold it to the line, but I ended up crossing the line with a big gap. And the reason was, people were thinking about sprinting 200 meters from the finish. They hadn't really thought through the way the course was laid out, and so they didn't expect anyone to go that early. So when I did, it took a lot of people time to react, and then there would have been no way for anyone to come around me, even if they had. So that can be a really, really helpful one. Physical obstruction, whether that's course or other riders. So if you're actually marking somebody and you don't want them to come with you, be really aware of where they are in the group, and if they look like they're boxed, go for it.
Yeah, exactly.
You just never know. And then we talked a little bit in my last example about crosswinds. Crosswinds are really hard to get a draft, and so again, going back to that mental hurdle of, you know, it's brutal to chase someone down in crosswinds. It sucks. So, you know, using that to your advantage and saying like, okay, this is hard. Everybody else is going to be demoralized. Like, this is where I'm going to go. And speaking to that, rain when it's raining is a great time to attack because for many reasons. Most people feel pretty demoralized and timid in the rain. Sure. So they're going to be really happy to let a brake go up the road. Might as well be you. And then the other thing
because that means they can race easy. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like,
right.
They're like, oh, I missed the brake. You know,
time to ride easy.
And oftentimes, honestly, in raining races, people are kind of looking for excuses like that.
Yes.
And if you're the one that's just like, I'm going for it, you can have that advantage. And then the other thing that's funny about rain is the spray that's coming off from people's wheels makes it harder to get right into the draft. So what you'll find is people are backing off the wheels, and so most people in the peloton in a rainy race are not getting a very good draft, which means that it's going to be even harder for them to organize a chase. So it's a great time to attack.
Yeah, those are really good points. That's awesome. It's like you're a pro or something, Amber. It's crazy, huh? Check out that video if you haven't. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's really
good. And Pete does a great job of breaking things down, comically so.
Pretty nicely.
Yes, he's very kind in doing so, but he's great at also pointing out how bad I was doing sometimes. So
it almost makes you feel good about it, though.
Yeah, exactly.
That's okay that you did that, but that's the absolute wrong thing to do.
Yeah, that's the magic of Pete, right? He'd be a great teacher. Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
Let's get into Matt's question. He says, hey guys, and hopefully Amber. I actually saved this one for this one. It's been saved for a long time. So Matt's probably already a Cat 1 here, but just the same. He says, and then he says, I'm a newbie and I've learned more than I thought possible thanks to you guys. 5 stars all the way. And he says, #beat Lance. If anybody's wondering what that's about, it's not that we're not fans of Lance Armstrong, but he has another podcast, obviously, and I think that we're ahead in reviews. So you can leave those on iTunes or wherever else you do. That'd be awesome. 5 stars, and if not, let us know what we can do to be better. He says, I'm starting off as a Cat 5, and I'm kind of what I imagine Nate to be in a donut shop, going after everything. I actually don't think Nate's a big donut fan. If anything, I would say that Nate in like a salad bar. That's like basically, that's peak Nate. Yeah, so going after everything. Or cereal bar. Loves cereal.
Cereal bar.
He says, I'm lucky enough to live in SoCal and have a plethora of available races to me. Even if everything doesn't go to plan, I should be able to hit 10 points by the end of March. So this is obviously some time has passed. We can learn from this. He says, some question. If I hit 10 points, and to recap how that works for Cat 5.
10 starts, isn't it, for a 5?
Yeah, 10 starts and 1 point for each start.
Gotcha.
And 10 starts in the sense that, like, if you get pulled, you still get the point, but you can't just start the race for a lap and then pull out. That's counted as like a DNF. So you don't want to have DNFs. Obviously, DNS doesn't give you a point either. So, but he says, if I hit 10 points or complete all those 10 races and I'm eligible for an upgrade, but still feel I'm learning a lot, should I stay in Cat 5 since I will really only have 1 or 2 months of experience? He says, I wouldn't try to be a sandbagger with this. Winning is a bonus, but I'm focusing on process goals. I'm just trying to maximize my learning opportunities. I feel like Cat 4 may be a better learning experience, as you have stated on prior podcasts, and open up more race possibilities, but I'm concerned about my only brief experience. Do you have thoughts on this? And I just want to point out, this guy is a hero, because I bet he's saying this, and there are a lot of people that have felt this, but they've felt way too nervous to bring this up, because it's this race to get out of Cat 5, and there's this there's this imposed shame from all the other above Cat 5 riders that you're still a Cat 5 rider, so you can't wait to get out from underneath that. So, Matt, you are a hero for asking the things that everybody really wants to ask, but we're all uncomfortable to ask.
I don't think I've ever met anyone who's not eager to get out of Cat 5. Everyone just wants to get done with their 5.
And we blame the danger of the racing as the reason. We're like, it's just so dangerous.
It's all dangerous.
And yeah, exactly. And honestly, I've seen, equally dangerous than in any category.
Oh, yeah, you can have a Cat 1 license and still be a very dangerous rider.
Oh, yes.
A lot of examples of that.
And be a professional.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Exactly.
It's going to name a name. It's just cruel. So I'm going to leave it alone. Okay.
Yeah, good job, Chad. So what would you say on this, Chad? Like, what would you tell Matt in this case?
I think it's pretty well known, if you've listened to the podcast before, what my stance is on this. I want people to take as long as possible to get through the categories if they feel they're benefiting from it, and he clearly still does. And even if you don't recognize that you're benefiting from it, there are benefits to be had. The level of competition in a Cat 5 can be pretty wide-ranging, so I do understand that as the excuse to advance to 4, because then you don't ever really know. They're always going to be a mixed bag. But in the Cat 5s, you got the people who have a ton of fitness but no race experience, and they just dominate, and then basically everyone else below it. So if there is an excuse to advance quickly through Cat 5, I would see that being it. However, just because it's a 10 race mandate, why does it have to stop at 10 races? Especially if you've yet to get a win, if you haven't got on the podium, you haven't really figured out how to be in a breakaway or how to ride comfortably in an ever-changing group of riders. There's still so much to be gained.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's something to add to that too is that you'll see more mentored races in Cat 5 than any other category.
That's a good point too.
So you'll have more opportunities to pick up, and some of those are great because it's like basically the race analysis videos we have. It's like a rider that's with more experience is going to walk you through those very things. So like more learning opportunities, and if you've won a Cat 5 race, never listen to anybody that says like as soon as you win you need to move up. There's no rule for that. And you brought something up that was really interesting with this, Amber, is the fact that like learning to win is almost an independent skill set from learning to race your bike.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's a totally different skill set. It requires a completely different approach. It's a different cognitive load. It's a different way of thinking about the race tactically. And I think most of us kind of go through this cycle with the categories. I know it was the same for me. Like you come up to the category, it's new racers, so you're having to learn your competition all over again. So you have all of these things that are different that you're having to really deal with. And most of the time you're getting your teeth kicked in when you move up a level. So you're so busy getting your teeth kicked in that it's really hard to get above that to really think higher level about the tactics that are playing out. And so you got to, there's these two ends of the spectrum. One is you want to challenge yourself in the races where you're getting your teeth kicked in. But you also want to be in races that are building your confidence and that are enabling you to think at that higher tactical level. So if you're at if you've been in a category for a while, you might find that doing local races, the competition, everything's a little bit more familiar. You understand the courses. Maybe the fitness level of the field isn't quite as high. So you have more mental space to think about the race tactically and think about how to win. And then you go to a regional or a national race where it's just really, really hard and you're getting your teeth kicked in again. And you got to balance those things. And my advice to athletes is always stay in your category until you've learned to win on purpose. And when you can do that, that's when you want to move up to the next level, because then you carry those sensations and those lessons learned into the next level where, okay, now you're going to be getting your teeth kicked in for a while, but at least you can hang on to that so that when you're in a position to win, you at least have some intuition about what to do.
You advance when it's a realistic goal to excel in that next category. Yes, you're not just going to jump into it and basically fly in the face of everything recommended when it comes to goal setting and put yourself in a spot where you cannot achieve those goals.
Right.
Right. It's like I'm sure there's a more technical term for this, but I always think of this too. Like I need to find things in life that are within my optimal growth range.
Yes.
And when I sit outside of that, yes, I can still grow in some degrees, but it's not optimal. Like we mentioned this with Lee McCormick when he was on the podcast, and with Nate the first time. The level of fear and arousal was so high that Nate was outside of his growth range.
Counterproductive.
And he couldn't,
unproductive at best.
Yeah. And so he basically got to the point where, we lowered that and we got into an environment where he could, feel more comfortable but still challenged. And then he started to really take steps forward.
Exactly.
And I feel like it's that's something, and that changes with every category. Like, and it's not like once you learn how to win a Cat 4 race, it's always the same. Like every race changes too, because it's not just the category, it's also the course and the sort of people you're racing, right?
Yep, exactly.
Like it's always going to be changing.
Yeah, and I think I talk to athletes about this too with descending as well, and you want to be pushing that edge of your growth, the edge of your comfort zone, which is where you get growth. But it's about walking to it and then walking back again, because if you're constantly living on the edge of your comfort zone, it basically means like you're just flirting with terror all the time.
Yeah.
And it's really,
Excellent
really
observation.
hard. It's really hard to learn when you're terrified. So if you're in a situation where you feel just a little bit more comfortable, then you can challenge yourself in different ways about, how you're going to tactically approach the race. And maybe you've learned to win, with brute strength, maybe challenging yourself on a course that doesn't suit you and figuring out how you can win that there. I'm a strong climber depending on the field and the terrain, but I'm not a climber per se. I'm 5'10", and it doesn't matter how much weight I lose. I'm always going to be 5'10". So.
Right, yeah. Compared to the 5'2", you bantamweight Italian climbers,
exactly.
right?
So there's like that's just how it is, and that's fine. I've learned to race to my strengths. But I was in this race that was notoriously difficult climb, this long 5K drag every lap, and we're doing 3 laps. And into the climb, there was a descent. It wasn't super technical, and it kind of went around a sweeping bend into the climb, but not crazy. So on the first lap, I managed to get away with a gal that was a really, really strong climber. It's like, okay, this is good and bad. This is like, okay, I got my separation. This is good. I only have to worry about one other person, but she's a really good climber. So on that first lap, we were coming into the climb. I got into like a really arrow tuck on the descent, and I noticed she couldn't come with me. So I thought, okay, this may be the card that I can play. And so the next lap, we came around to the descent again, and I was thinking, okay, if I get away here, it's going to be a really long way by myself. I'm not going to use this card yet. So I didn't tuck that time because I didn't want to create a pattern and become predictable, which we talked about in
so smart
separation. So I didn't put my cards on the table. I kept that one close to the chest, and then the next lap, coming in the final lap, I full on attacked the descent, and I got into a super, arrow tuck, and I created that separation. So now I had a gap on her for that final climb, and it was a mountaintop finish up this 5K climb. So the whole time up the climb, I'm just looking back like, she's got to be coming. But to the point that we discussed earlier, I got out of sight.
Yeah.
And she was tired because we'd been off the front all day together. And so she just kind of mentally packed it in. And I think probably if she was really committed to chasing me up that climb, she probably could have caught me. Yeah. But I managed to kind of create that mental situation that gave me a little bit of an advantage. And it was kind of fun after the race. She was like, you got to teach me how to descend like that. And I literally went over and showed her exactly what I did because I thought, you know what?
Yeah. Let's
make it harder for me to win next time. It's a good challenge for me. But it was interesting and funny because it's, sorry, I'm losing where I was going with this point, to be honest.
The thing that I find with that is the fact that you basically pushed her outside of that growth range.
Yes, exactly.
And then when she was outside of the growth range, that's when she calls it quits, right?
Yeah.
The cool part about racing as many times as you can in whatever category you are in a more safe environment within that growth range is you're going to come across the descending scenario. You're going to come across the solo break, the 3-up break, whatever else, all the different scenarios.
How do you manage the things that scare you? Like I worry about climbs because I have a hard time keeping up with the climbers. So how did I manage that? Okay, well, I wanted to be first to the climb. How am I going to do that? And how I was going to do it didn't become apparent till I was in the race.
Yep.
But I had the mental space there to really be analytical about what was happening and come up with a plan. So it can really help.
So I see a lot of people kind of saying so maybe there's a local racer who's really fast in your region and you feel like he could be a professional racer. Or you have a situation where they're like pro riders, and like mountain biking is a really good example of this, road too, but where over in Europe, the level is higher, right? It's just, it's a lot higher. So in one regard, we sit back and we say like, for us as Americans, why don't our American riders just live over in Europe all the time? And if they live over there all the time, then they'll just rise to that level. But you mentioned a key point about getting to the spot where you actually can start to, I guess, build confidence and because a lot of the time you already know what you need to do to win, especially if you're like a pro level. On paper, you could write down exactly how to win that race, but it's different in the moment having confidence and actually making it happen. And you mentioned Kristen Armstrong, like doing something to kind of manage that every year.
Yeah,
cool.
I remember when I first started racing, I was with Webcor, and she was racing for Lipton, and she was doing this interesting schedule where she was going over and racing in Europe for block, and then coming back in the States and racing for block. And I remember talking to her about it, and she said she goes over to Europe, because it's the challenge that she needs, but she needs to come back to the States and do those races to just remind her that she's capable of winning. So the racing in the States provided her with this, maintenance of a high level of confidence, which then she could carry over to Europe. And I think for a lot of athletes, and to be fair, she was very successful in Europe as well. But I think for a lot of athletes that go over to Europe, whether it's Europe or it's going up to the next, category or racing nationally, you can't race there all the time because you forget how to have that confidence and that mental space to be really tactical about your approach. So it's a balance. You want to really train yourself at that edge of your comfort zone, but you also want to train yourself in the area where you're comfortable enough to feel really in control of what's happening and really in control of your ability to just even evaluate in the moment what's happening in the race.
Yeah, along those lines, people often refer to like when you get your Cat 1 upgrade, it's like, oh, okay, you don't like winning. Sounds good.
Yeah,
because you're not going to win anymore.
Yeah,
that's like what a lot of people say, and it's tough. And you basically get into this thing where
it's
like
progressively tough. It's exponentially tougher, moving category to category to category, and then I mean, just imagine being at the world level. There are guys who race their entire careers and not a single win.
Yes.
Yeah, and when it becomes your job isn't to win anymore. Your job is to ride for somebody or do something like that, right?
Sure.
And that's it. But then for most of us that aren't paid to race, that are listening to this, it's winning's great, and winning is really fun. And so if you're in a situation where you're thinking, I feel social pressure to move up, but I kind of also don't want to move up quite yet.
Yeah, do it for your reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because the winning, you put a lot into all of your training. You put in a lot of hard work if you're listening to this, and it is nice to have some payoff. That payoff can come in other forms than a win. Sure, like plenty of other forms. There's different measures of success, like Pete Morris has said before. But at the same time, if you find yourself on the edge and you still want to get some confidence in the fact and remind yourself that you can win, do it.
And there's a bit of an ego trip to it too. When you say I've gone from a 5 to a 1 or a 5 to a 2 or a 4 to a 2 in a season, and you can rush that progression because you're strong enough and maybe you have enough race savvy, or for whatever reason the circumstances aligned and you got your points and you upgraded, or at least had the option to upgrade quickly. You exploit it, and now you get to tell everybody I did this rapidly.
It's a big
That's all good and
achievement
fine, and that's what I did. That's what Amber did. That's what Nate just did. And you miss out on so many learning opportunities. Because I think back on that, and I think if I had just stalled as a Cat 3 and made myself stay there for a while, rather than chasing the next upgrade, I could have learned so much in the 3 races, because the 3s at my time were, and still are, they're very competitive. They were huge fields.
Yeah.
And one thing I didn't get a lot of exposure to was riding a lot in big fields, moving up in big fields, not just hugging the fringes and not just doing, overworking myself. Just learning to conserve power over the course of a long race. Didn't get any of that either because I had a big motor, so I'd always position myself toward the front, get stuck in the wind a lot of the time, and it didn't always pan out. So if I could have made myself, if I would have been coaching or if I would have had a coach who told me just hang out in the 3s for a while, spend the rest of this first season as a 3, I think I would be a different bike racer. I know I would be. I think I'd be a better bike racer, a more well-rounded one.
And I think it really depends on who you have around you. So I was in a really unique situation where I got to be on this club team, like I said, that had women who were 1s and 2s. So even when I was a 3, when I would go to race, I had their immediate input during the race, before, during, and after the race. So I was like on this crazy steep learning curve. And then, even when I got into the 1s and 2s, I was racing in the Bay Area, and the WebCore Women's Pro Team was there. So they were showing up to all the local races. So I was getting this really awesome, it was like this perfect alignment of stars to have this awesome, crucible learning environment. But that's not the case for a lot of people. And if you don't have a coach or really experienced teammates who are helping you learn from every race and debrief, then give yourself the space to do that. There's nothing wrong with that, and it'll really pay off down the road, honestly.
That actually resonates with me too, because I was on a very strong masters team with some riders who had a ton of experience.
Yeah, it helps a lot.
I benefited from that after every single race and during every single race.
Yeah, I mean, part of the
every
reason
single race.
I was able to progress so much was my now husband, then boyfriend, was a Cat 1 at the time. So even as a Cat 4, we would show up to the races and he would say, okay, 10 laps to go do this, 5 laps to go do this.
That's cool.
And I would just step by step, I'd do what he said and be like, oh, I won. Guess this guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, that's really why we do these race analysis series too.
It's super helpful.
Yep. Yeah, you can do a lot with very little. And recapping on that. Yeah. There's a ton of learnings to be had. I mean, even like you said, Chad, looking back, you would change the way you did it. So it's cool.
And there are. And even if you think there's nothing left to learn, I promise you there is.
Right.
Yeah.
And
something.
One last point I want to make is when you move up to a level and you're getting your teeth kicked in, oftentimes the limiting factor is your fitness, because you're you are so on the edge of your physiological limits that it makes it really hard to think. It's really hard to think when you're really on the rivet. So building up your fitness to a point where, okay, now the fitness isn't the limiting factor. Now you're in the group. Now you can really start to think about, okay, who's going for breaks, what teams are working together, and then then you can really engage on a tactical level. So give yourself the space and time to get there and to do that.
Awesome. Matt's question, this one definitely applies to Chad and I, where we tend to be on the pasty end of the spectrum.
Fair-skinned?
Sorry, fair-skinned. Yes, exactly. Matt says, what's your sunscreen regimen for longer rides? So maybe we should answer that each one of us, like what we do for that, and then we can get into. You looked into a little bit of the science behind some of this.
Yeah, I just want
Chad?
to talk about what ultraviolet radiation does. Or,
Cool.
what we need to concern ourselves with, what sunscreens mean. It's not a deep dive by any stretch, but it is a little more information than I think a lot of people have on sunscreen.
Cool. So on long rides, Amber, what's your sunscreen regimen?
I usually put on a very generous amount, about 30 minutes before I leave the house, and that's it. I don't stop to reapply, but I do make sure I put it on. I'm not putting it on as I'm going out the door because I want to give it at least a significant amount of time to really soak into the outer layer of the skin. And then my hope is then it's not just sitting on the top and then, dripping off with sweat. So,
Yeah, I tend to be, and I'm sure that people are going to get upset at me for this. So sorry, but
we'll find out why. I have information on why. They have good reason.
Okay, yeah. So I tend to use spray-on sunscreens because I've found that they stay on very well for me. And then the other side of it too is I can apply it much more effectively to my back and to everything else. Because I think a lot of the time we think sunscreen on our face, and then maybe on our arms, hands, or legs, something like that. We don't think on our back until you do a long day, and then you get a bib short tan line on your back.
Really painful, fun little designs.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit easier for me to apply. I feel like I can get like a full coating. But I have heard that they're not very great. And then I have reapplied before. I actually, like when we talked about this prior, when we were prepping for this, I thought, I've never reapplied. And I thought back, I have on really long days. The death ride, for example, is like a really long one locally.
When it's a non-race circumstance.
And it's a non-race, right? Yeah. If it's a race, I've never applied mid-race.
Probably not going to do it during a race.
No, I've never reapplied. No.
Hang on, guys.
Yeah. You can't call for a break, for a sunscreen break, even though we probably all should. But Chad, what do you do?
In this case, I'm a do as I say and not do as I do, because my habits on this are anything but consistent.
Got it.
So if it's a short ride, a lot of times I won't even put it on. If I know it's going to be a pretty shady ride, I won't put it on. I'm in the school where chemicals on my skin just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
It kind of freaks me out. If I can't eat it, I don't want it on me, and I certainly am not going to eat sunscreen. But I do recognize there is a need for it. So if I'm going to be out for a long ride, I absolutely do use it. Don't reapply. I've never reapplied except when water's involved, and I've been literally and figuratively burnt by not reapplying in situations involving water. Very recently, actually, and it was a good wake-up call.
Yeah, triathlon's kind of like a whole different beast.
That would definitely change my approach.
Yeah, and to be fair, when I say I don't reapply, most of my training rides are 5 hours or less. So, most of them are going to be more in like the 2 to 4 hour range. So I'm not going out and doing 6, 7, 8 hour days.
Yeah, regularly. So what did you learn about sunscreen, Chad?
So
what's the point and what are we getting at with it?
We've all heard for sure. I'll give you my best attempt at an answer. UVA and UVB rays, right? Okay. We always hear there's UVA protection, or we need to concern ourselves with UVA protection. Sunscreen covers the UVB base quite well. So it really comes down to the type of ultraviolet radiation. UVB being shorter waves than UVAs. The shorter or the longer the wave, the more deeply penetrating it gets. So with UVB, short waves, your epidermis does most of the protection in terms of guarding you from radiation. That's not to say your skin can't get burnt. So sunscreen absolutely has a place, because you burn your skin. That's oxidation. That's DNA damage. That's potential DNA mutations, which potentially leads to things like cancer, melanoma being the concern with the epidermis. The other end of the radiation, and that's about... I think that's most of the rays. So most of it, like 95% is blocked by the epidermis. So I'm guessing that means 95% of the radiation is UVB. I'm going to make a leap there. UVA being the other, more deeply penetrating, actually reaches the collagen, which can cause structural damage. And while in and of itself it doesn't damage DNA and potentially set you up for cancer, it does cause oxidation, free radical damage, which can in turn eventually lead to DNA mutation and potentially cancer, amongst other afflictions.
It certainly probably isn't going to help recovery.
No, absolutely not. But the thing is UVA is the big concern. Sunscreen does a really good job of protecting against UVB, but it also makes us think I'm safe, I've got sunscreen on, when in fact the UVA is still going to work on you. But there are ways to protect against the UVA also, and that comes in. There are clothings which are rated. They have a different. It's called UV protection factor. So like a UPF is the acronym for it of 50. It means that 1/50th of the radiation is actually getting through. So you've reduced it to only 1/50th of what is actually touching your body. So it is new territory to me. But these fabrics are rated with this UPF designation.
And this isn't just like sleeves. I've seen people use sun sleeves, but this could be jerseys, bibs. I've seen a lot of fabrics them that come with UPF.
I don't know if they're coated with it, if it's the knit of the fabric.
I think the actual individual strands of the fabric are actually coated with it. And so then when it's woven together, all of them compose basically a protective layer. Gotcha. At least that's my understanding. I could be totally wrong.
Sounds pretty good. Yeah, it wouldn't be hard to look into. And then opaque creams. So, and I know you're going to hopefully help me understand the difference between chemical and mineral sunscreen, but I'd be willing to bet the zinc oxide is on the mineral side of things.
Exactly.
And because it's an opaque cream, that can actually and does protect against those UVA rays. So there are sunscreens that are capable of it, but most of them not so much. And it's not... the FDA doesn't have any requirements for UVA protection. So if a sunscreen touts UVA protection, it's questionable.
Interesting. So the spray-on sunscreen, that's where that is not as good because it's usually not. I mean, I haven't used a spray-on that's opaque or anything like that.
I don't know how it could be. It's too thick to spray. Is my guess.
And I'm talking like aerosol spray ones. Yeah.
I like them. I like how they cover and I like how easy they are to apply. But UVA protection being the concern that it is makes me wonder if that's a good approach.
Interesting. And I guess on the other side of things too, and I've actually I was as this world is as I guess frequently does. I for some reason on my Instagram, we were putting sunscreen on my son or something like that in the background. We were at the lake, and I had so many people yelling at me because we were putting like a chemical sunscreen, I guess, on our son instead of a mineral one. Because it was a spray.
It's a touchy topic.
Yeah. So like chemical versus mineral, that gets like really like there's like that's darn near vaccination territory on terms of
very
people being
contentious.
What is and do you know much on this in terms of like chemical versus mineral?
So
Amber?
I'm by no means an expert, but I do remember having this concern a long time ago because I'm spending a lot of time in the sun here, and so I did talk with the dermatologist, and she explained that there are chemical versus mineral sunscreens. So zinc oxide and zinc oxide, titanium oxide are the two main mineral ones. So it's creating a physical block, whereas there are chemical versions of sunscreen that block it more chemically rather than creating like a physical barrier. So that's why when you put on zinc sunscreen, it's opaque because it's creating a physical barrier. And a lot of people don't like that because if you're trying to apply it every day and you're just going about your normal life, like you don't want to look like Casper the Ghost. So
exactly.
But there is kind of this ongoing discussion that mineral sunscreen is healthier for you and poses less risk than chemical sunscreen. I haven't ever done a deep dive on this, but it's just a risk analysis thing. I mean, there are risks to everything that we do. There are risks to going out and riding your bike. And, I think most of us would agree that those risks are fairly minimal and worth the enormous benefit that we get out of being
riding
fit and having a well-balanced life.
Yep.
So
that's a good point.
I think a lot of this stuff just comes down to personal preference, and you just kind of make a decision for yourself about what types of risks you might want to.
Well, and that's a good point too. I mean, the more healthy we are, the more healthy our diets are, the more our antioxidant system actually does its job.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you don't want to burn your skin, so you got to protect your skin. But in terms of the radiation that does reach us and causes free radical damage and oxidative damage, we counter that with our antioxidant system and our antioxidant intake. So that's a point that there is a balance to be struck there, a potential balance.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with that too, like I think that constant balance that we need to keep present, it should help us on a lot of decision making with all of this stuff. And if you are a person that's beholden to mineral sunscreens, then that's awesome, and you can do more of that. However, I think that if you're trying to do anything at all, it's better than nothing. And it's something that we definitely we definitely recommend. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, there
on
was.
this one,
there's an adaptive effect. I mean, our skin produces melanin to protect us from the sun's rays, from the sun's radiation, right? So fair-skinned people don't produce as much melanin, don't produce it as rapidly, but we can cultivate a response so that our melanin content in our skin does climb. It's kind of the basis behind a base tan. You know, people who are in an office all day have pasty white skin are going to travel to the tropics. It's just your word, not you. But they're gonna travel somewhere where they're gonna get a lot of sun exposure, so they go into the tanning beds, or maybe they spend a little extra time in the sun to propagate this response. And it's effective. It works. I'm not gonna say it protects us from deep radiation and all the harm that comes with exposure, potentially comes with the exposure to sun. But in terms of not burning, you can cultivate a stronger protective response.
And you had mentioned the other day just the benefits of vitamin D production too.
Yeah, that's honestly, I was going to tack that onto this, and it made me realize that I really would like to do an entire dive on vitamin D specifically and how sunscreen counters the production, the sun-derived production of vitamin D.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, so you can take a lot of pros and cons to this.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
and kind of similar to the concussion side of things, just because you aren't burned doesn't mean that you aren't getting harmed from the harm from UV rays.
Yeah.
A lot of the time we assimilate that only if we get burned that there's a problem. Right?
No, your skin does a really good job, and the darker skinned you are, it does an even better job of protecting you from the UVB rays.
Yeah.
Not so much. I don't think that carries to UVA.
Right.
This probably has a lot to do also with the latitude at which you live.
Oh, absolutely does.
So,
for sure.
And just different climates.
Yeah, even like when I lived down in Chile for 2 years, and they have like a very weak ozone down there, I guess. And as a result, ozone wasn't doing its job in terms of taking care of a lot of the radiation and the rays that can come through. So
Or altitude.
And you would get not only, even if you did get visibly burned very quickly, but also outside of that, you would even if you didn't have a visible burn, you felt like you were out in the sun all day when you were just out there for an hour or two.
Interesting.
Interesting to see that. So next question is from Reese. It says, good day, Chad, Jonathan, and Nate. Definitely from Austria,
G'day, Reese.
right? Yeah, not Australia. Dumb and Dumber joke for anyone. He says, love your live YouTube Ask a Cycling Coach podcast. I've learned so much, 10 out of 10. We're nearly at the end of winter here in Australia, and with spring just around the corner, that means crit season. It's crit season for them. What do you suggest once we are in the thick of crit racing season for training? Our season lasts 6 months, and I mainly just race on the weekend. Do I keep up the intensity, do long, slow work, or target certain zones to keep myself in peak condition through the weeks, months, and season? Love to hear your thoughts.
And we've talked about this a lot.
Plenty.
But we have an awesome resource on the matter here, so I'm pretty much going to shut up now.
Yeah, because we do this in our own little very non-professional ways, but you have had to do this as your job, Amber. It's very different when you have to look at a whole season of racing, and then you really do have to make sure that you are, perfectly fit at the right time.
Right.
So how did you manage that? Was it trying to keep the pace high all year, or did you try to pick and choose?
Well, first off, what sort of race frequency did you see? Like, how many days a year would you race?
I had a couple years where I raced over 100 race days in a season, which was a lot.
That's a lot.
That's heavy. Most of the time, it was more on the order of 70 to 80 race days in a year.
That's a ton.
It's a lot though, and so the pattern that I would see, and again, this was my job. Build up big volume preseason, so you're building a nice base, and then as you get into the racing season, you actually allow the racing to be the part of your training that's building out your top end, and then so in a sense you're almost racing into race fitness. Not completely, because you're still doing some high-end work to prep for the race season, because you can't come in and be totally ineffective, but as the race season goes on, the intensity and the frequency of the racing is so high that it's less about building fitness and more about desperately trying to recover adequately between races.
Yeah, sure.
And so then the race is less about, increasing your FTP or your VO2. It's more about just desperately, again, trying to recover. And so the volume comes down significantly, and then oftentimes, the racing is all you need to maintain a level of fitness to be effective.
It's almost like you're sharpening the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. And then So you're really trying to stave off overtraining and overreaching. But then to your point about it's not like you come up and you reach this amazing level and you hold it all season. It's just not possible.
That would be so great.
It would be so great. And
that's the dream.
Most people do try to build in a mini break somewhere in the middle of the season. So you'll kind of have 2 peaks during the season.
Because, if I can interrupt, what do you do on those mini breaks?
Some people will just take a whole week off, totally off the bike. It really depends on what's going on with you. I remember one of the earlier seasons I did with Webcore, we went up and did the Tour of Montreal, and I sucked. I mean, it was brutal. And the week before I'd been flying, and then this one I was just tail gunning, and it was a really technical stage race. And so every road race was flat and technical, and I was just yo-yoing off the back the whole time. And thank goodness this team had the compassion and the presence of mind to just sit me down and say, "You're cooked. You know, you need to stop riding."
Nice.
And they pulled me out in the middle of the race, and I stayed around and helped in the feed zones and stuff, but they weren't gonna. They were like, "You've already dug too big of a hole, so you need to stop riding for a little while." I think I took a couple weeks off, and then I had one of the best seasons I've ever had. So you have to be sensitive to that, and it's really easy when that intensity really ramps up to do too much. So to somebody who's doing a crit season, though, you're not necessarily doing back-to-back stage races. You're not doing 80-mile days. Crits don't require a ton of volume to stay really fit and effective. So, I would say generally you want your volume to come down as your race frequency goes up, but you still need to maintain that aerobic efficiency, and you still want to maintain that sharpness. But I don't think anyone can realistically maintain a peak for a full season. So you have to be willing to understand.
That's kind of exactly what a peak is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's why they're called hills and mountains, not peaks, right?
Or plateaus.
Plateaus.
Right. So I guess when you're in the thick of a crit season, what does the middle of the week look like? I mean, you have weekends, and I know that you never did I don't think you ever did a season of just racing crits. But I guess what would your recommendations be? And this really goes for both of you guys. But Amber, what would it look like when we're talking about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday? Are they going to be doing long rides? Should they be doing short, intense rides? What would you think they would be doing? Or what have you done?
So when I very first started racing in my collegiate season, I was kind of on this similar schedule where you were racing on the weekends and then in classes during the week. And so I think, first of all, let me just say what your schedule looks like depends a lot on what else is going on in your life. So, really take into account whole life stresses, not just the stress that you're experiencing in the bike races. So I would usually I would always take the day off 2 days before an event. And then the day before the event, I do openers, and then I'd have a recovery day on the other side of the event. So that's already 3 days out of the week plus an event day or 2 event days. So that's doesn't leave a lot of room in the rest of the week to do much training. So then it would be more like, okay, how am I feeling? Do I feel like my aerobic efficiency is suffering right now? And then I might build out, I might focus more on a couple longer days. And longer days for a crit season, you really don't have to do more than 3 hours, I would think.
Yeah.
Just to maintain that level of aerobic efficiency. But you might also feel like your snap is suffering. So maybe if you have a race coming up that's flat and you're going to be needing the snap, then you can tailor those workouts, your training days, more specific to a goal race, for example. But you really do need to build in that recovery. You need to have the day after the race to just wind down even mentally. And you want to, you don't necessarily need to go into every race fresh. One of the things we talked about is there's a lot of benefit to learning how to race tired. And I know that some people disagree with that philosophically, but I really think it's important. And one of the things it can teach you is when you're really tired and you're really suffering, it teaches you to be super efficient with your energy usage, really efficient. And that's a great way to train tactical racing too. So
so much of what you described is exactly the recommendations we've made in the past. So
and I'm looking at the crit plan right now. I'm looking at the crit plan, and it's basically that. I mean, you have once you get into the race season, it's a day or two of sharpening, but then other than that, it's allowing your body to recover.
Yeah, and I typically I see just 2 days of intensity a week being kind of the breaking point for most people. I mean, you push that third day of intensity, and it's okay every once in a while. If you have like, maybe you did a workout during the week and you had a double day on the weekend, or double, two races each day. So then you got 3 in that week, and that's going to happen from time to time. And there's plenty of benefit to be had there too. But I think if you try to do that on a consistent basis and you're going hard, I mean, really hard, 3 days a week, race hard, it's going to break down really fast.
Right. Yeah. And you'll see that on like the CRIT plan, for example, it's suggested that you sub one of those higher intensity days that we have on the weekend for the race. So if you look at that, it breaks down to basically 2 to 3 of higher intensity ones a week that you would have if you sub one for a race.
And the science is there. I mean, 2 to 3 is the general recommendation, and there's plenty of research to back it up. But in my own experience, I see 2 being the proper number. More times than not, a couple days a week is all you need. That third day is usually what breaks the camel's back.
Right, and the races are really, it's a high level of stress. It's a much higher level of stress than we can achieve on our own in a training session. But also there's a lot that goes around it, right? Because most people,
that's where I thought you were
it's
going.
not like you roll out your front door and you're racing. Like you're loading up the car, you're road tripping. I mean, there's a whole, you're getting your equipment ready. I mean,
just the psychological stress of knowing you're going to put yourself out there, and the danger of it, how hard it's going to be. Am I fit enough for it? All the self-doubt and the things you have to deal with on top of it. So cognitively, psychologically.
Yeah.
Emotionally.
I think the biggest thing that you have to, and it'd be wonderful if we could somehow measure recovery as effectively as we can measure work. That's the holy grail that everyone chases, and we still haven't cracked it.
It's improving.
We're getting there, right? And actually, along those lines, something really interesting, just an aside, on the flight back from Eurobike, I was sitting next to a Stanford researcher who had dedicated, I think, the last 10 years of her research entirely to HRV.
Oh, interesting.
So we had a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, I wouldn't let her sleep.
And it was funny. She actually said she said that she was like, I never talk to people on planes. I don't know why I'm talking to you. And so it was like, but we had a great conversation. She was extremely pleasant. Alex, it was great to meet you. But she said, and this is coming from a person that studied HRV for 10 years entirely, and Stanford researcher. She said that she doesn't consider HRV to be anything that she would ever use for a predictor of performance potential, and that's after tons of studies. She felt that basically HRV had been taken on a hot promise by a lot of marketing folks and utilized. And we actually kind of talked about this before when Pete was on the episode. We talked about we talked about HRV in general, but using the Whoop, that sort of stuff. And for all of us, we found a total decoupling and things that don't just tie in. And it's not like a direct measure, So we're not there yet. And maybe HRV has a role in that. And I know if somebody's listening to this and they're like, I live by it perfectly and it helps, and that's awesome. And if that's the case and it correlates for you, that's great. But in my case, at least, my situation definitely aligns with that, because that would be great during that time frame when you're really trying to maintain or stretch a peak, right? It'd be great to be able to measure it with precision, but this is just another added point to making sure that you're doing structured training instead of just non-structured training all the way through. Because if you do a whole season of structured training and you really stick to your plan, you have a known quantity for your work. It's measured, and it's something that is progressing as it should. So as a result, you have kind of a control that you can use for all the other variables in your life. And as a result, you really start to get a good, clean fix on what your body is doing and how it's reacting.
There's never going to be a be-all, end-all single metric that tells you can train today.
Right.
There's so many things that fold into it, and overlaying all of it is how you feel.
Exactly.
Yes. And that's the cool part about following structured training for a very long time, is you really start to dial in your understanding of how your body is feeling. And sure, you can always make mistakes and curveballs can come your way. But I find that, looking at like the CRIT plan, and like you said, Chad, you found that 2 days is what works for you. And we recommend this with all of our plans, that you change things and with the calendar, it's super easy now. You can just drag and drop and change. And that's the one thing that I find is I'm constantly adjusting and changing things when I get into that phase, because I'm trying not to err on the side of caution. I know I'm not going to get a bunch of fitness increase,
right?
But that's going to happen.
And it's really hard to pin down just how stressful a race is going to be on you in the days following. I mean, you do a race, you really gut yourself. Maybe you don't realize just how deep you went or how frequently you went deep, or just the stress you carried into it, the stress of not sleeping in your own bed if you traveled, the stress of travel itself. I mean, there's so many things that a race file is not going to tell you. So you have to pay attention You can't assume it can be the same race that you did last year, and you may have ridden it the same way and gotten roughly the same result and feel very differently after it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. And another thing with this is you don't have to peak to win a bike race. I mean, if you have an A race, definitely peak for it because you want to put yourself in the best position for a result. But it's not always the strongest person who wins the bike race, and it's not always the person who's feeling best that day. I mean, I've won a lot of races feeling terrible.
My best training rides are hungover rides. I feel awful.
Seriously. Yeah, it's almost like you know this is going to hurt, so you're like mentally prepared for the suffering.
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, here we go. We're just going to get stuck in. And so, don't feel like you have to maintain some high level of taper or freshness in order to get a result. That's not the case. And learning to race through those sensations of fatigue can be super, super helpful. Earlier, we were talking about when to attack, and I had mentioned another story that's a little bit relevant here. So there was a stage of the Gila several years ago where I raced with a broken rib, and it was brutal. And let me tell you, it's like one of the most painful injuries you can have that you can still ride with. Yeah. And I accidentally got in a break of 3.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Things are going great.
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah. So it was this ridiculous. So I got dropped on the first climb, but I can descend well. So I was descending, and as I came down to the bottom of the descent, I had tons of momentum. Speaking of timing attacks. Yeah. So I felt terrible. I was putting out almost no power, but I had all this great momentum from the descent. So I just came up the side of the peloton, and literally the second I came up the side, 2 women attacked, and it was literally like I literally coasted onto the wheels of this attack and then ended up in this break of 3. And in the moment it was happening, I was thinking, okay, sweet, I can, because I felt so useless because I had a broken rib, and even the night before in the team meeting, the director was like, what are you gonna do? Just go ride, see what you can do. And I was thinking like, yes, I'm gonna be able to. I can at least cover this one attack. And the next thing I know, we've got 3 minutes on the field, and I'm going, this is terrible because it's Gila and it's super windy, and my 2 brake mates were both about 5'2", and they're both sprinters, and we are getting blown around, and I was in so much pain. And by the time we got to the finish, we were just so cracked because I don't know if you guys have raced Gila, but it is
no, it
brutal.
Does not look very fun.
It's brutal, and it's exposed, and it's dry. And so as we were coming into the finish, I'm thinking, okay, this is it. Like, I'm committed. The team has put their faith in me now, and I have to find a way to win this race. And I literally got to that point, trying to even draft. It was hard for me to get in the drops because of my rib. And I had looked at the finish earlier because even if I know I'm not going to go for the finish, I always look at the finish, just make it a habit out of it. And I had noticed that at about 300 meters, it was a mostly flat finish, but at about 300 meters, there was just the tiniest dip. And I was thinking, okay, everybody's really tired. Nobody, and these are 2 sprinters, so I'm gonna need to surprise them. So as we were coming into the finish, I made sure I was at the very back, of the 3 of us.
The field.
The field. And I went for that dip because I thought if I can be the first one to crest before the dip, I'll get that tiny acceleration, like teeny tiny, but it might be enough. And I need everything right now. So from behind the 2 of them, I blew across the road as fast as I could, and it was just, you see red. I mean, it was so painful. I can't even, because you're pulling on the bars with a broken rib, the whole thing, and everybody's just tired and cracked. But 2 things to my advantage. We were all tired and cracked, so I don't think, nobody really wanted to be the first one to go.
Yeah.
So I took the bull by the horns and went for it. And that tiny, tiny little acceleration, I think, honestly made the difference because one of them was coming up on me really, really fast, but I ended up winning the stage on a day where I thought I would be completely useless. Like, literally, the director had said, we expect nothing from you.
Yeah, so it just shows, like, even when you're not in peak fitness, the efficiency and everything else, it can help you.
And it wasn't even like you got out there and were surprised that you had a good day. You just got roped into something.
Exactly.
And
I had a terrible day. I won on a really terrible day. And that's the fun thing with bike racing is it doesn't matter how bad you feel, you almost always have a shot because you never know how the tactics can play out.
That is the take home.
The last point that I'll add to that is just the fact, and this just adds upon that, but if you show up to a race and you feel like I missed my peak or anything else like that, so do other people.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's not like everybody else is perfect.
Yeah, and it's not like all your fitness evaporates just because you're slightly past or prior to your peak.
Yeah, exactly.
There's still a lot of fitness on the table.
Right.
Yep.
Right. It's all money in the bank.
Sarah's question. She says, I've been a Trainer Road user for the past 6 years and only recently discovered your podcast. As a women cyclist and listener, really appreciate how gender inclusive you all are and love that you invite female guests like Sonia Looney and Amber Pierce. Thanks for a great podcast. Definitely 5 stars. We need to be better at that. We constantly want to be better at that. So more female guests because Chad and I aren't very good on usually, we haven't lived in those shoes. We don't really know what we're talking about there. No. So thanks for coming on, Amber. We appreciate it.
Of course. And thanks you guys. I appreciate I mean, you guys do a great job, honestly.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're
Perspective
blushing.
of at least one woman.
We're blushing. Says, my question has to do with fitness plateaus. You've talked a ton. This is kind of timely with what we're talking about on peaks. Mm-hmm. You've talked a lot on the show about plateaus and often attribute them to things like lack of sleep, changes in stress levels, changes in diet, etc. And it's really motivating to hear Nate say that most people haven't hit their genetic potential, but I wonder if I have. I'm turning 40 next month. I've been riding seriously for the past 16 years, racing on and off for the past several years as a Cat 3. And over the last year, I lost about 15 pounds and saw a bump in my fitness and FTP. I'm currently 119 pounds with an FTP of 214. I've followed the high volume sweet spot base and high volume build plans for the past several months. I usually don't feel fatigued, so we'll add an additional hour or 2 of endurance rides on top of the prescribed weekly workouts. She's doing a lot.
That's a lot.
Yep. It says I do my FTP test regularly, and I've been disheartened that my FTP hasn't increased over the last 6 months. None of the usual culprits apply to me. No new stress. My sleep is consistent. My diet's consistent. I'm consistent with my training. Have I simply reached my limit? And how do you know if you have reached your limit? Thanks for all you do. From Sarah. So one quick thing that I noticed right off the bat is the fact that she currently weighs 119 pounds and she lost 15 pounds. So we're talking like, plus 10% a drop in weight. Mm-hmm. And that, depending on, what sort of body composition
we don't
changes.
know what the composition of it is. And honestly, that's a pretty healthy rate of loss. I mean, if you can typically try to keep it somewhere between 0.5 and 1% of body weight per week, 1% being the higher end, you can push it farther than that, but then you can affect testosterone, you can affect sleep, you can affect so many things if you overdo it. I honestly don't think that's the factor here. I mean, it's definitely worth noticing, and it's good that she noted it.
Yeah.
But unless that was all lean mass, I don't think that's a factor here.
The one thing I feel like that you have to keep in mind, though, is that when you do drop that much weight, your body will change the way that it fuels itself. It does a lot of different things,
but
right?
Having done it over a year, I don't know that she probably butted up against any of that.
Yeah, who knows?
It's a guess, yeah.
But I'm getting at a principle here, Chad, right? Is the fact that
no. We all.
But a lot of people.
Rapid weight loss does not work.
Yeah, well,
sure.
and the big thing is.
And weight loss.
We assume that, I've lost weight, so I'm just me at a lighter weight. And while that is true in some regards, it also, your body changes when you're losing weight. So and what I'm getting at with this is the fact that what's worked for you before may not work for you now if you've had significant changes
that's true.
To your body.
And if that's the one thing that's changed over the last year, maybe there is something in that.
Yeah, but I guess that latter point to that is possibly, I think that, what we would all get at with this is that in terms of stimulus, if you have a stimulus coming in and you're doing the same thing over and over, change can have a profound impact on moving that needle in one way or the other.
Agreed.
But I guess we'll leave that for just in a little bit. What are the other things that you see with this, Chad? Kind of whether it's red flags or just points that would stand out in this case.
Yeah, so I don't know. We haven't done the math on the watts per kg. We should probably do that real quick because really for a female, unless you're 4 plus, it's pretty unlikely you've topped out physiologically or genetically.
I think it's really unlikely for most people.
Yeah. So
it's tough to reach.
I don't think you've reached your genetic potential. In order to do so, I think you'd have to have a life dedicated to sport. And it doesn't sound like, even if you're on a high volume plan and adding mileage, that you're that. You probably, did she mention what she does outside?
She's just at 4 watts per kilo, just tipping.
Oh, well, that is.
So she's right
close. Up there, and at 40, that's up there. Mm-hmm. So that is back on the table. You could actually be coming up against that limit, but let's assume that's not the case. Mm-hmm. And look at the fact that you're doing quite a lot of sweet spot, which is a big resource pull on your body. Mm-hmm. I don't know if your diet is accommodating that. If you're not losing weight anymore and you leveled out, it probably is. Mm-hmm. But you're doing a ton of work and you're adding work on top of that, which leads me to believe, I don't know what your recovery regimen is. If you're throwing in that every fourth week, every third week, if you're bypassing those weeks, if you're maybe doing a little bit too much during those weeks. But most of what I read here smacks of just being flat, just being at a point where you can't nudge it any higher. You don't really fall any lower, but you've plateaued.
Here's the brain logic that goes on that we all laugh at in post, but in the moment we're like, it's not working. Just do more, right? That's like what we think.
The common and usually faulty response.
Yeah, and that's usually what we think. Oh, I'm sure, especially on the pro side.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
You have coaches telling you that you can do more. You have a teammate that somehow puts in 45 hours a week. And so you're just like, well, why can't I do that? And we fall into that trap of comparison and trying to figure out where our limits are. But one thing that kind of stands out with all of this here is the fact that if she's sitting around 4 watts per kilogram and she's stuck and she can't move that needle, the one thing that I see a lot of riders doing, and I think that this is possible even if she was higher in terms of watt kg, is she could change her fitness profile. She could change the way that she puts out power.
There's actually
you've done that, right,
exactly.
Amber? I mean, like you've been a sprinter, you've been a domestique. I'm sure you've shifted the way you've trained and changed your profile.
Completely. I mean, there's always something that you can improve with this, and I'm noticing this. She does some racing. It really depends on what your goals are, and FTP is one number, and it's one component of this whole suite of systems that we have at our disposal. So there's the anaerobic system, there's your VO2, and when I look at this and I'm thinking sweet spot, I'm thinking, maybe again, to your point about stimulus, you have stimulus, response, and adaptation. And if you're consistently getting the same stimulus, you're going to be eliciting the same response. And your body is designed to adapt. So eventually,
get good at
you're
it
going to
go
get
backwards.
Adapted.
Yeah.
And so you want to mix up that stimulus. And one of the great things you can do is start training kind of more extremes. So what I mean by that is like, I don't know how easy your recovery is. Maybe your recovery, for a lot of people, that's a key thing. People don't realize just how easy you need to go to adequately recover. And then when you really recover well and you're actually fresh, which a lot of people don't ever get that sensation because they're not recovering enough, but when you're actually fresh, you can go really deep. But what ends up happening for a lot of people is they're not recovering either easy enough or long enough to be fresh enough to go as deep as they actually can. And so you think you're going deep, but you're not actually going as deep as you're
everything gets misaligned. You get habituated to feeling fatigue, and you don't even recognize it as fatigue anymore.
Exactly.
It's baseline. It's where you think you reside, and you think, well, this is how I feel on my post-recovery days, post-recovery weeks, so I'm recovered. I'm going to hit it again.
And this can happen on any type of training that you're doing, right? Like you could be doing a ton of VO2 stuff every day. You could be doing a ton of long, slow distance stuff every day. The principle that we're talking about is changing that stimulus, but of course, at all times, making sure that you're able to recover enough with that.
And then she lists a number of things that have remained consistent: her stress, her sleep, her diet, and her training. Consistency does not imply optimization. It doesn't mean all of those things are as good as they can be.
Exactly. And maybe being consistent is part of the problem, because if you're consistently doing sweet spot, and you're not building in an easy enough day or an easy enough recovery week, you might be going through the motions of the plan but not going easy enough, or going through the motions of the plan and then not going hard enough on the other end. So I was a swimmer before I was a cyclist, and I joined the swim team at the age of 10. And it cracks me up to this day to look back on this. And I really thought I was doing it. Like, they'd say like, okay, do 100. I'd do the 100. I'm doing it. What I didn't realize is I was going through the motions, but I had no frame of reference for what it meant to work hard. I didn't know. So I thought I was ticking all the boxes, and I thought I was doing a darn good job, you guys. And I remember one time the coach just took me aside after workout one day, and he was just exasperated. He's like, "You realize you loaf more than anyone else on the team, right?"
You're just not pushing hard enough.
I was just not pushing it at all, at all. I was just flopping around for a few laps.
Yeah.
But I didn't know any different. And he sat me down. He's like, these are, it should feel hard. It should feel really hard. And I was so grateful, because who sits down and tells a 10-year-old that?
Sure.
Right? But it was such an important lesson for me. And so it was kind of like, oh, I had no idea. And once I knew and I started pushing myself and discovering these new, sensations and how hard you can actually go, it was really fun.
You
and
recalibrated.
Then boom, like my work ethic soared, and all of a sudden I started getting really fast.
That was the low-hanging fruit when I had my indoor classes.
Yeah.
So many people came into these classes thinking they knew how to work hard.
Yes.
Then I introduced them to actual hard work.
Yeah.
And they got faster, and they're like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
They put it all together. I mean,
Right.
Yeah, that happens. Like we need things to once again, it's just a change in stimulus, right?
Right.
It's upping it in one degree or another.
And the other thing, I just want to pop in here real quick. The what worked for you last year, what might not work for you this year. And this is a very frustrating aspect of training, because we spend so much time testing and figuring out what works for us. And you're like, okay, I finally got it. And then the next year, something in your body changes. And it doesn't have to be sleep. It doesn't have to be something in your life. It doesn't have to be even something that you really notice. But the truth is, you're just not the same person year to year, because there are things about your body that are changing. And so, even if you're not aware of that, you're not aware of what specifically is changing, just an awareness that, hey, I'm going to need to evolve as an athlete and as a person, and maybe try something new. So again, to the point about the stimulus, it's like, if you want a different result, you have to do something different. And so sometimes consistency, as much as it is something to strive for, it's something to strive for until it's not working anymore.
Yeah, it's not the only thing.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Can I throw in some recommendations that I would have for this athlete?
No.
Fire away.
We'll just move on. So Sarah, I found myself in kind of a similar situation to you last year, really. And one of the things that I actually ended up doing was I ended up dropping down to doing our traditional base plan. I did the mid-volume plan. I actually started with low volume just because time didn't allow.
Yeah.
But then I went to the mid-volume plan, and then I moved forward with, so it was just a long base phase. And then I moved forward into sweet spot thereafter, and I saw a bump in fitness in terms of FTP, but also just in terms of perception, in terms of everything else too, and my ability to be able to go through things. So I don't know if it was a psychological change that I needed. I don't know if it was just a physical change that I needed, but that was helpful for me. The other thing too is once I got into my training session this year, I ended up shifting things around a whole lot in terms of like I started stacking days back to back. I started changing things around. We've talked about so many different ways to change your training plan. Feel free to shift things up and to see if that makes a difference.
It's a continual educational process.
Yeah,
you
we're always
never
changing.
stop learning. You never stop asking questions. You never stop tweaking things and seeing what works, what doesn't.
That's what makes it so fun.
Yeah.
Well, it's frustrating, but it's also fun.
It's both those things, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you hear some knocking, by the way, we apologize.
Sorry.
We think some painters are working on the building right now.
Tried to squash that earlier.
Yeah, we tried to tell them, but I didn't flash my belt buckle. That's the problem. I should have flashed that. They would have listened, I'm sure.
We should have stocked up
blinded
on some
them anyway.
knock jokes.
I know. Yeah. Kai says, "Hi guys, I have a question about the effect of caffeine and the absorption of other nutrients. I'm seeing a lot of information online about caffeine blocking the absorption of important nutrients like vitamins, minerals, iron, magnesium, countless articles and studies online." So he said. He says, "I also found studies discussing the fact that caffeine actually improves carb absorption. I guess being able to absorb carbs better is beneficial, but what about the other nutrients in our carb sources? The advice is to space out caffeine intake from food intake by about an hour to minimize the negative effects. I sometimes ride in the morning and have a light, quick breakfast like an energy bar and a banana and some dried figs or dates and 1 or 2 cups of coffee. Wait about 45, 60 minutes and I'm off. Same goes for evening rides. He says it equals coffee and a banana for an evening ride. So does the caffeine actually diminish the absorption of the other important nutrients in these foods, mainly magnesium and calcium? Am I overthinking this? We've never, all of us listening to this, we've never been guilty of overthinking something. So he says, would be greatly appreciated if you could shed some light on this. I really enjoy the podcast and always put it on during my gym sessions at home and absorb all the information. That was a good joke there.
Absorb,
pretty good.
clever.
Yeah. And of course, 5 stars. Awesome. Thank you for submitting this one. Chad, you looked into this a little bit, huh?
I did, yeah. So first off, typically all we concern ourselves with is the mental effects or the neural effects, the brain effects with caffeine. So I was just going to touch on that really quickly.
Yeah.
So we have receptors in our neurons, or in our brain cells, called adenosine receptors. And over the course of the day, as ATP is broken down in the brain, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, being the energy currency of basically every cell in our bodies, maybe not red blood cells, but breaks down from a triphosphate. We break a phosphate bond, releases energy. It's now a diphosphate. Break it down again, and it's now a monophosphate. Break it down again, and now we just have an adenosine. And it's over the course of the day, there are, if I understand this correctly, enzymes in place that inhibit rephosphorylation. So typically we rebuild ATP so that we can break the bonds again, and we just keep on cycling ATP to keep energy coming. But over the course of the day, these enzymes cause they basically inhibit this rephosphorylation, so that adenosine just sticks as adenosine. As adenosine accumulates, it starts to stick to these receptors, and this tells us we're tired. We start to get drowsy. Caffeine is very much shaped like adenosine and can block those receptors. So it actually occupies the same space that the adenosine would occupy. And so we basically mask the drowsiness or keep it from taking place in the first place. Problem is we habituate to caffeine usage. And what happens there is we get more of these adenosine receptors. So now we have to take more caffeine. And what does the body say? Okay, you still need to get tired. We still need to sleep. More adenosine receptors. So at some point it tops out, and basically this is where we all get to. We get to a point where we're not really getting a buzz from caffeine anymore. We're just leveling out each morning. So we go to bed, or we have our caffeine in the morning, or over the course of the day. It just diminishes. We wake up in the morning, bring ourselves back up to snuff, and just go on about our day. So, and this is typically what we look at. We're only looking at because we know it reduces our PE and it makes us cognitively sharper, and there are all these mental benefits to it. And it doesn't really, we don't typically look farther than that. And it's for this very reason that other than its effects on iron absorption, I hadn't even considered what caffeine does to micronutrient and nutrient uptake.
Yeah, it's something that never crossed my mind.
Me neither. Yeah. So
can I just jump in with one thing really quick? And so that really, when you're talking about our bodies habituating to it and not getting the benefit, that's why they've talked about like basically cycling caffeine usage, right?
Absolutely.
So then we can still get that buzz and a more profound psychological effect from it.
Exactly. Which and from a hyper user, or even just people who are normal coffee drinkers. I mean, it's like the most widely used drug in the world. So pretty much everyone's on caffeine, and pretty much everyone has tried for whatever reason, or just had the decision made for them to come off caffeine for a period of time, and it's not a pleasant process.
It's terrible.
You've tried that, right, Amber?
Yeah.
But like amidst training and everything else?
Yeah. So I was working with a nutritionist one year, and we decided to give this a shot and see how it went. I'm a very typical coffee user. I love coffee, and I have it every morning.
As most bike racers are.
Oh, it's great. True. I'm really suspicious of bike racers who don't drink coffee.
So am I. Or beer.
We're weird. I'm super weird.
Looking at you, John.
So we tried this where I did a week off of caffeine leading into a race, and then I had over 300 milligrams of caffeine, I think 2 hours prior to the race. And wow. So wow on a couple fronts. Wow, was it terrible to not have my coffee every morning.
Yeah, and what's funny about that is you remembered it as being a 3-week washout, and then she looked at her notes, and it was a week.
It was only a week. It was
felt like it,
in
right?
my mind, it felt like this 3-week slog. It was awful. But then before the race, and I had 300 milligrams of caffeine. I mean, I was seriously jacked. And it was great. Like, I felt super hyper focused during the race, and I felt like I was firing on all cylinders, and it was this awesome sensation. But after the fact, when I really kind of evaluated the whole of the experience, I lost so much effectiveness on every training session for the week leading into the race that I felt like on the whole, the benefit that I got on race day just wasn't, it didn't offset the losses. Because I'm still a big believer in, you do a good training session one day, you build out a good week, you build out a good month. That's how you're really going to make the gains. And losing, just optimizing every training session to me just seems worth more than, I don't know how much of a percentage benefit I really got at the crit. It was interesting and it felt pretty awesome, but I don't think it was that much better than...
And I can only help but see that as just another stressor you're heaping onto a pile already.
Yes.
I mean, training's hard enough, and if caffeine is that little extra bit of something that helps it become tolerable,
it was so hard.
And you can push yourself a little harder and therefore make it more productive.
Yeah,
that's
good point.
It's a really strong argument.
Can I tell a quick funny story?
Yeah, of course.
So one of my teammates...
Yeah, actually, no, you're sorry.
No. One of my teammates is this major coffee snob, and most cyclists I know are major coffee snobs.
Snobby about it, yeah.
And so we'll travel with, hand grinders and whole bean and the whole... scales and thermometers for water
super
temperature.
Nerdy.
Super nerdy.
Yeah.
So I had one of my teammates was very strict about this, and she almost never. I mean, I'm kind of a coffee snob, but I'll have drip from the community pot any day. But she would get up early every morning and make her coffee, hand grind everything. And so one morning I got up. We were usually the first two to get up, so I got up and I watched her kind of stumble around the kitchen, and then she reached for the pot of drip coffee, the community pot, and I was like, oh man. What's happening? It was like the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And I kind of looked at her. I was like, what are you doing? She looked at me with this mug in her hand. She goes, I need a coffee to find my coffee.
Yeah. Sounds about right. Sounds about right.
It's like, yep.
That's funny.
Yeah. Being on the other side of the fence, it's pretty nice to not have to have those sort of dependencies.
Yeah, you're not weighed down.
But
So
definitely, yeah. And definitely on performance side of things though, it absolutely helps. What about on the nutrient absorption side? What could you find out from that?
So a lot of this is largely based on a review. I found a 2014 review, which is just looks at a whole bunch of studies. And I think this went from like 2014 back to the earliest I saw was 2003. So we're looking at a 10-year span of published research on the effects of caffeine on nutrient absorption. Authors Sadek Volda, so W-O-L-D-E, 2014. If you're interested in looking at the study, we can probably link to it. We can definitely
link to it in the forum.
So iron, I knew. Iron was the thing I thought of when we talk about caffeine disrupting nutrient absorption, but I don't think too much about it because I know how to circumvent the interference. So caffeine intake interferes with iron absorption. The concern there is red blood cell production. Obviously, that's a concern as an endurance athlete, but as a person, period. And then they've noted everywhere between 40 and 90% reduction when iron is combined with caffeine. And it depends on, what you're eating, what your caffeine intake is, et cetera. But it really comes down to timing because these effects don't even take place. There's no decrement, or at least minimal, not significant if you buffer it by an hour. Save your caffeine to an hour past your iron ingestion, which, and this goes for a few other micronutrients, is all the reason you should need to table your caffeine until an hour past if you take a multivitamin or if you take any form of supplements. Give the caffeine about an hour because it will interfere with some of them, iron namely.
Interesting.
This is like a very good justification for cyclists that like long coffee breaks, long on their coffee rides. Yeah. There we go.
Excellent.
So science backs you up. You're doing the right thing. Yeah. What else?
Quite a bit actually. So, but there is a silver lining at the end of this, so don't sweat it.
Cool.
First off, calcium. So for every 150 milligrams of caffeine ingested, and that's a pretty common dosage. I mean, that's a pretty strong cup of coffee. It's not a hard dosage to get. For every 150 milligrams ingested, you lose about 5 milligrams of caffeine through urine and feces. So we discharge it. Calcium, yes, sorry. Calcium. So caffeine inhibits calcium absorption in the intestinal tract also, and it depletes the amount that we retain in our bones. So small impacts on both those fronts too. It's again, don't worry so much. So these are obvious bone health issues, right?
Yeah.
And these calcium losses can occur hours after the intake of caffeine. So it's not like it is with iron. There's not this narrow window where
double downer.
Yep.
Amber's just gonna leave here soon. Yeah.
But the recommendation is quite simple, and it's to limit your caffeine intake to 1 to 2 cups, 3 cups at the upper limit a day.
I'm gonna plug my ears.
100. I think they consider a cup 100 milligrams of caffeine. So we're looking at 300 being the recommendation. Don't exceed 300. That's where they put moderate intake, heavy intake or high intake, however they term it, starts at about 350 milligrams. And obviously some of this is going to be based on, I would have to say, the size of the person too. I mean, a 200-pound man versus a 100-pound woman, 300 milligrams is probably going to have a different effect.
Right.
I don't know.
So none of this is gospel, but it is a recommendation to not overdo your caffeine intake. Vitamin D also suffers because caffeine inhibits vitamin D receptors. So just like the inhibition we talked with caffeine masking the adenosine receptors, similar here. And D is crucial in calcium absorption. So we got kind of a bone loss double whammy here.
Man.
B vitamins.
This is all good. Wow.
B vitamins. So caffeine is not, they've pretty much debunked the whole idea that it has diuretic effects, but it does have diuretic-like effects because it comes with a whole bunch of water. So we whiz it out.
Yep.
And anything that increases urination means that water-soluble vitamins are kind of subject to the loss. Exactly. So we're going to whiz some of it out again. Interferes with the metabolism of in particular B1, which is thiamine, and thiamine has to do with carbohydrate or glucose metabolism, nerve, muscle, and heart function. So it's a worthy concern.
So that may be where he was getting at with the original comment there.
Yeah. A lot of what he said, found plenty of information to back it up.
Yep.
But caffeine also helps the body absorb B12.
Yes.
So there's a small win for caffeine. And B12, I can't remember, it starts with a C. It plays a part in DNA synthesis, fatty acid metabolism, amino acid metabolism. And then other vitamins and minerals of note, it could reduce your absorption of manganese, which has to do with, there's a function in the brain, central nervous system, enzyme production. Zinc, which as we all know, contributes to immune system health. Copper, which has to do back with iron absorption and red blood cell production. It can increase the excretion of magnesium, which, as we all know, it plays a heavy role in muscle and nerve function, and a lot of roles for magnesium. Potassium can also be overly excreted, and that has to do with muscle function, specifically our heart and our respiratory muscles. And then sodium, and we've talked about sodium plenty, hydration, blood pressure. And then even phosphate, which is, we just talked about adenosine triphosphate becoming diphosphate. I mean, it's very crucial in energy metabolism. But, and also interferes with the action of vitamin A. So I'm just going to heat more on here, get it all out.
So what you're saying is it tastes good and we should eat more?
Wipe out the rest of it. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying be moderate and just like anything else. I mean, if you get excessive with it, there are going to be repercussions. So in defense of caffeine, it is still an antioxidant, and anything that's an antioxidant has myriad benefits. Anything that reduces oxidative stress and free radical damage is good for us. I mean, it stacks the deck in our favor in terms of diseases that come with aging, with just about anything. I already mentioned the effect on RP and performance. It just makes us feel like we can go harder. Cognition, of course, we feel sharper mentally. And then just as I mentioned, disease protection and prevention. And there's a direct correlation between caffeine intake and reduction in occurrence of cirrhosis. So if you're a beer drinker and a coffee drinker, level playing field, just wipes it out.
There's this great family that I stayed with.
Science.
There's one of the host families I stayed with early on in my career. I still keep in touch with them. One of the things she said, I'll never forget it. I ride my bike to fill the time between coffee and beer.
That's perfectly stated.
Sounds about right. Yeah. So I guess what would be a moderate ingestion?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, and this pretty much carries across all the papers cited in this particular review, is that 300 milligrams a day is a good cap. Anything above that, and you are kind of putting yourself in maybe not harm's way, but nutrient deficiency or issues with nutrient absorption.
If we're talking like if you're peaking for a race or something like that, and you want to be, pinging for that
or
race.
Or maybe just in general, maybe 300 is, and 3 cups of coffee. I mean, that's a pretty,
lot. That's hefty.
Yeah, that's I think enough for most people.
Right.
And there are people, and this is a word of caution to people who pride themselves on the fact that they drink a ton of coffee.
Yes.
Maybe it's not the best thing. Right. I mean, do you really need me to tell you that though, when you're drinking your 6th or 7th cup of
Probably
coffee?
no. They probably know. Yeah, moderation in all things is like a universal principle, right?
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, I see it as balance, but it's basically the same thing.
Yep.
That's super interesting. I just learned a lot.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah,
that was my day yesterday.
Great question.
Yeah. Can we go into Mike's question? And then I think that we're going to go into we'll go into Mike's question. We'll go quickly through Mike's question. Okay. So then we can get to Nolani's question.
We still love you, Mike.
And then, yes. And then that way we can get to some of the live questions that you're submitting right now on YouTube. So please continue to do that. And we'll go through them soon. Okay. Mike says, I've really appreciated the focus on sprinting technique from your recent race videos. I assume he's talking about the race analysis video where technique analysis video where we broke down Nate's sprint versus Pete's. Nice. Good job, Chad.
Well done.
Yeah, we're like a little duet over here. He says, when during a race, should this technique be used? Take a 4-corner crit as an example. You might have to accelerate 100 times before sprinting for the finish line. So should this technique be used out of every corner or closing every gap? Chad, do you want to lead off?
To which I replied, God, no.
We've all been that person and seen that person. Yep. And usually about halfway through the race or earlier, things are not going very well, right?
It doesn't usually end well.
You can only do it so many times.
Yeah. Now, there's one thing about having proper technique when you're out of the saddle and pedaling your bike. But when you're sprinting, as that intensity goes up, torque goes up, tension needs to go up, technique needs to be more precise and fit into a specific mold, so to speak. Right. And it all is very costly in terms of energy. And because, yes, every bit of tension in your body is energy that's being used that theoretically could go to the pedals, but you reach a certain point where you need that tension in order to put as much torque as you can through those pedals,
and
right?
muscle capacity, and there's a limiting effect on the brain. So there's a lot of things working against you if you do it too much. So
stepping back from that, you can still put out a good amount of power without doing that. And that's what you would recommend, right, Amber?
For sure.
Not sprinting all the time.
Oh my gosh, no. So I would say when you're talking about just like a full gas sprint, you want to save those for your 100% commitment moves. Yeah. And so if you're a breakaway rider and you don't want to be in that bunch kick at the end, like you want to reserve the sprint for your race winning move, or if you're doing that 1K to go, I'm going to try to solo into the finish. That's when you need to do it. But this is not something that you want to do out of every corner. So better than that would be, try to slow down less in the corner so you don't have to accelerate as much out of the corner. And if you do have to accelerate out of the corner, there are ways that you can kind of leverage your body skeleton and the mechanical advantage that you have without putting a lot of muscular force into it. So really you want to use this, you want to really reserve your full out sprint for when you're 100% committed to the move. Let's see, there was something else.
If you're finding yourself and frequently finding yourself in the position where you have to really get on it as a sprint, I see that as lack of anticipation and poor positioning.
Yes. Yeah, 100%.
Or lack of patience.
Yeah.
Right? Because if a gap opens up and you're panicked about closing it, chances are someone else is too. And if you wait an extra 4 or 5 seconds, someone else will get antsy and they'll shut it down. So, if you can, use the efforts of others before you use your own energy source.
That is such a good tip. And I feel like a lot of us, our first advice that we got with criteriums was like, stay in top 5. And if that wheel squeezes out more than 6 inches away from you, you better sprint to hold on to that thing. For real. And I'm sure that a lot of us did that for the first race, and it feels really rewarding because you completely wrecked yourself, right?
Yeah, for a 30-minute
so
crit.
Tiring for a 30-minute crit, but you could do it for 30 minutes. But things change when you get in, like with really fast racers and everything else, and you do have to put a premium on efficiency. And a lot of people, whenever of course, I watch every video that we put out, all the race analysis ones and everything else, and I always laugh at the comments because on the internet, I'm not sure if you guys know, but we're all experts on the internet, right? And
that's what it's for. It makes everybody an instant expert.
It's amazing, yeah. And so many people get so mad at Nate and tell him exactly what to do and that he's opening up gaps and he shouldn't be letting those gaps open up. And while Nate actually admits that back in the day he had a problem with opening gaps because he was actually worried about riding so close to riders, that's not the case anymore.
Right.
He's really just trying to smooth things out because the energy cost of efforts as power goes up is exponential, right? Or at least it's not a linear relationship.
It's curvilinear. So, it goes.
Yep. Starts to get really high. And so if you can basically, like if a rider surges in front of you or a group surges in front of you, and to hold on to that, you can either sprint and do 900 watts for a few seconds or for like 1 second and kind of like latch onto that. Or you can do something like 500 watts for 3 or 4 seconds. That 500 watts may be a lot less relative to your threshold. These are just funny numbers, but it may be less costly. And you'll have to kind of figure out where that line resides and always kind of test your best guess, so to speak, with that. But I've found that I think I have really high repeatability for most riders. Like I have an ability to punch over and over. Yet when I look at races where things went south and I missed the crucial move at the end, or I wasn't able to really execute like I wanted to, almost always it's because I had a ton of efforts early on that were sharper than they needed to be.
Right. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yes.
Yep.
And often in racing, you feel really, really good in the beginning. So you're like, oh, I'm on fire today. And
so does everybody else.
And it feels so easy to just shut everything down. And exactly. Everyone else feels great. And then you feel great until you don't. And there's not really much coming back from that. So, a good rule of thumb is that it is easier to shut down a small gap than a big one. So, one of the things you can do is just take a preventative approach and be really, really focused on what's going on and try to anticipate what people are doing. and not put yourself in a position to have to close a gap. But if a gap opens up, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to jump across or, like you said, put out a huge
cover it instantly.
Yeah, no.
It also is like such a great tell. I'm grateful for racers that do this. Although if I was to give them advice, I probably wouldn't. But when racers are they sign everything before they go. Like what I mean by that is it's like
shift.
You see them shift a few times, grip onto the drops, maybe tighten a shoe.
So here we go.
And it's like, I think we're just closing a gap here. We're not going for the field sprint, but it's really common. And it's just like a very clear sign, because getting into this sprinting position is a very clear, it's darn near like a bull dragging its foot in the ground. You know what I mean? Like it's a very clear sign that you as a unit, as a human, are about to do something at the max, right? Yeah. So the more subtle you can be, the better chance you have at catching people by surprise, which, like you talked about, in terms of getting a gap, is one of the most important things. Yeah. Nolani's question. She says, when do you think is the best time relative to a women's menstrual cycle to do a ramp test?
Oh, I got this one.
yeah. Chad and I will be back. We'll just say, he says, and we do get questions on. We don't get as many questions actually as you might think on this, in some regards, but perhaps logically as well, because we're three men. So I totally understand why somebody wouldn't come to us and ask this.
I do have him. I have studied up on this, and I have read Stacey Sims' lore, and so I'm not completely in the dark, but I am probably not the best resource considering.
I don't know why you guys are looking at me. But.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm glad that we have you here so we can address this one. So she says, we know that a woman's performance changes throughout the cycle, increasing during the first 2 weeks of the cycle and then going down in the high hormone weeks. The way that the training plans are set up time-wise, sometimes the ramp test may fall in either one of those phases. So depending on what time of the cycle it is when you take the ramp test, you may be selling yourself short during the other phase because of underestimation or overestimation. So these are her assumptions here. Mm-hmm. Yep. She says, would you consider manually increasing or decreasing the FTP a few notches accordingly to account for this? Or would it make more sense to change the training instead, to have more sweet spot workouts during the high hormone phase, more VO2 more workouts during the low hormone phase? Or I might even change that around to say just higher difficulty, lower difficulty, right? Because for some people, that stuff is easy or hard. She says, or would you suggest moving the ramp test from its assigned spot in the plan so it is always performed at the same time of the cycle? Which I assume can be tricky for a number of reasons. But she says when you had Amber on, she mentioned that there was 1 or 2 days where she couldn't do a VO2 max workout. And in candid discussions with other female athletes, the variability over the cycle seems to be more pronounced than when we were younger, making it at times impossible to ignore and causing debilitation for up to a week. It's like knowing that you're going to be predictably sick for 1 out of every 4 weeks. How would you modify your training schedule accordingly?
I think there's a couple questions here. One is about timing the ramp test, and then one is about modifying your training schedule around it. And, I think both are important and warrant some good discussion. To her point that your period changes and your symptoms, I'll call them, but it's just how it is. It changes as you get older, and certainly for a lot of women, it's the case that kind of the negative impacts of this do become more and more pronounced. Mm-hmm. And the other frustrating part of this is they can also be just different month to month, and that's, regardless of age. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to predict exactly how you're going to feel. I think the big thing about this is just having an awareness of it. And I want to kind of back up to what I said before about the VO2 max. For me, it wasn't that I wasn't physically capable of doing it. I could do it. It was just that the RPE was so much higher for me that in working with my coach, we figured out that it wasn't worth it to do the workout on those days because it really messed with my head and would affect the quality of my training downstream. So it was sort of like, okay, for me, it was really my confidence and my mental state were really, really important to my training. And so if I were a different person and it didn't affect me as much in terms of confidence, and I just knew on that day the RPE was going to be really high, I could do it. So it wasn't like
any impact on recovery if you push through it.
There probably is, and that's one of the things that is a potential impact for the high hormone phase, which I'll get to in just a second. And I'm not sure, honestly, that I could have decoupled the physical recovery from the mental recovery.
Gotcha. That's a good point.
Just being honest about that. Probably, there may have been a physical impact, but I don't know that I could have told you. Okay,
didn't really matter.
Right.
You were down.
I was just down. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So mood is it's really important to training. So
huge.
To this, whether or not, I think adjusting your FTP, I don't think you need to do that. Number one, I don't think the effect feels big. Sometimes it can feel really significant, but I don't think that there's any way you could get it right. So if you're adjusting your FTP up or down, like, you're never going to just nail it right, so it's going to be within a couple percent. I don't think that that's really going to be the difference. And I want to look at, let's just talk about some of what actually happens. So
cool.
There are some hormone phase associated symptoms that tend to become more pronounced with age. We talked about that. And then some of the things that can happen in the high hormone phase. And the high hormone phase is like, there's just kind of a gradual build of hormone until right before the period. And then it all kind of drops precipitously, which initiates the period. And so what you can see during that high hormone phase with those hormones is that you can see a decrease in plasma volume. So that just means that
thermoregulation suffers.
Exactly. Thermoregulation suffers, hydration status suffers. So you want to just, there are things you can do to offset this, right? You can increase your electrolyte intake, increase your water intake, just be really on top of your hydration. It does actually increase your core temperature, which may or may not be related to plasma volume, but we do know that core temperature is related to rate of perceived exertion
and performance.
Mm-hmm. And so if you know that you're starting with a higher core temperature, there are things that you can do. If you're hydrating well, it can help keep that down. If you know that you're going to be training in hot temps, maybe an ice vest or, even trying to thermally acclimate, ahead of time might help. There's increased sodium loss, so going back to the electrolytes. And then progesterone in particular ramps up, and that's a catabolic hormone, which means that you're breaking down muscle, or at least you're not rebuilding it at the same rate as you normally would. So your recovery might suffer. And again, these are all pretty minor. I mean, they can be more or less significant depending on the month, depending on your age, depending on the individual. So it's more about figuring out what it is that's affecting you. And obviously, there's kind of something that you can do for each of these. So even with the catabolic effect of the progesterone, you can increase your protein intake, or maybe take some extra BCAAs. And Stacy Sims talks about this in her book Roar. It's a really, really great resource. As with everything, it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. So you want to try, just see what works for you. But as far as arranging your training plan around your period, if your period is really regular and you can predict and plan around it, I don't see any reason not to, especially if you are experiencing really severe symptoms. If you are feeling to the point where you feel like you're sick 1 week out of 4, then maybe that's not the time that you want to do your really, breakthrough workouts or the really, really important sets.
That's your recovery week.
Exactly. Make it your recovery week. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that you can do in terms of timing your training, and then a lot of things you can do nutritionally and hydration wise to offset some of these things. And it's just a matter of experimenting and seeing what works for you. I do want to mention in the forum last time, and by the way, I just want to thank everybody for the amazing forum discussion we had last time.
Pretty great, right?
It was so awesome. And it was really cool. And I always like to tell people to take everything I say with a grain of salt, because it doesn't apply to everybody, but it was really fun to hear
2
from
grains
people.
for me. Like, you need 2 for my sayings. Yeah.
It was really fun to hear from people who had tried some of the things, and whether or not it worked for you, I just love that people try it and see it and share the experience. So yeah.
One quick point that I want to make is, you said that like these things are minor, and while they may be relatively minor, a cyclist has probably spent thousands of dollars to increase plasma volume, decrease core temperature, right? Increase our sodium retention, all these different things. So like, even though they may seem relatively minor, and for cyclists that are chasing marginal gains, like, it's absolutely something. So adjusting your training, once again, we said this earlier in the podcast, but it's absolutely something we recommend.
The adjusting your training relative to your menses, your cycle.
Do it.
100%.
Yep.
And in terms
of about the FTP test, however.
Yeah, I was just going to go there.
Go ahead.
Right. It's really not like we all fall into this trap. And we basically think like, I need to have a perfect day on my ramp test day.
Right.
Which I'm here to tell you is about the worst thing you can do to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Your best day ever is where you set your benchmark. That's pretty tough, right?
Yeah.
So, and we have this kind of mindset that like, everything needs to be perfect for that. But think of your average in the sense that, like, as you carry on through 3 weeks of training, where life stress and everything else puts you in terms of performance potential. And that's where you should be. And I know the reason that we don't want to do this is because we attach our self-worth to numbers, right?
Yeah. So
whether it's a race result, or whether it's an FTP value, or whether it's any number of different things that we can measure about ourselves.
Yeah, honestly,
we tend to do that.
Just ditch your ego and see it as another workout.
Exactly. It's a data point. It's just a data point. And every data point, every piece of data that we bring, and nothing's actually, it's all plus or minus within some band of error.
Totally.
So you're basically, it's a guide. It's not a definitive definition of who you are as an athlete or who you are as a person.
It's a good point of reference.
And I also want to clarify, this isn't necessarily minor for some people. For some people, the cramps that you can get are honestly debilitating. And I do know some athletes, some of my teammates at Stanford on the swim team, could not physically train. They would be like curled in the fetal position. It was so bad. So for some people, it can be extremely significant. But in terms of your performance, if you're not, physically debilitated by cramps, I want to say that it can be minor in relation to other things that are influencing your performance. So if you have other life stresses going on, if you're not getting good sleep, there's a lot of other things that can affect your performance. And one of the questions I got in the forum last time was like, what did you do as a pro? Did you just not race on those days when you felt so bad? And no, absolutely not. You never show up to the start of a race at 100% anyway. And the effect that my hormone phase would have on my performance was, for the most part, relatively minor compared to, did I crash the day before? Or, am I overreaching at this stage of my training? There's a lot of other things that can play into this. So I think it's important to be aware of it, to notice it, to figure out how it's influencing you and how, whether some of these mitigation strategies can work for you. But I don't think it's something to like really, really fixate on any more than other aspects of what's going into your performance.
Yep. Absolutely. Cool. I think that that one's more or less covered. Can we move into some? Fantastic. Chad and I can't say a lot of those things. We can't say like just train through. That's so. I'm really glad you're here.
Taken seriously.
Yeah. Seriously, huh? Let's go into some of the YouTube questions that we have here. So MTB, as Sean says, I know you guys have talked about DOMs, but can you please do a small talk on prevention and ways to reduce it? Because I'm suffering right now. Yeah, DOMs is pretty terrible.
Probably more gradual progression. So if you're heavily afflicted with it, if you really did yourself in and you're sore a couple days out, more than a couple days out, you probably just overdid it. So
delayed onset muscle soreness, by the way.
Oh yeah. So, and it's a bummer, and it's going to happen at some point. The severity of it will depend on just how much you've outpaced your current level of fitness.
Right. Yeah, and as I recall from the previous discussion on DOMs, there was no take this and this is a magic remedy to get out of it.
Sadly, no.
It takes time.
Yeah.
Like once you've got it, it takes time.
Time's like the only cure.
Yep.
You can do all these other things, but what's happening in the meantime is that you're just getting past the damage and it's healing. And maybe there are things that can facilitate that healing. I don't even want to open that discussion. Just say that DOMS takes time. And if you've done something that you're not used to, that's well outside of the amount of stress you've heaped on yourself, whether in a strength realm or an endurance realm, you just got to ride it out.
Right.
Yep. Tons of talk about the bike case thing, and a Psycon case has existed like that for years. It hasn't existed like that. This is a unique one, and you'll see once you check it out. That's why it's exciting, because it's light and it's like super easy to use, and it's also not soft at all. It's perfect, basically. So well done, Lock. Okay, another question that we have. Oh, and then one more thing on that. Somebody said, man, you just take the wheels off. I hope they'll have that for mountain bikes. We asked them, and I don't think that'll ever happen because mountain bikes are with the handlebars being wide. That makes things.
But
a
even
little
just
more
turning
difficult.
the bars,
maybe. But even then, man, 800 millimeter wide bars are pretty wide. So it'd be a tusk sticking out of the front of that
unicorn.
thing. Yeah, unicorn.
Hammerhead
exactly.
or a unicorn.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay, so some folks are also chiming in. This is a ton of fun, by the way. You should join in the YouTube side of things because you can join all the other podcast listeners. Some folks are talking about the fact that they chose to move up really quickly and they regret it too. There's a ton of talk. I've never heard anybody say that they regret that until we had this discussion. So this is cool. Hopefully it's opening.
Yeah,
it
no
up
one
for
wants
people.
to be accused of being a sandbagger, but honestly, there's so much that you can gain.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Somebody asks, when you enter your weight into Trainer Road, should this be your weight in full riding kit? In my opinion, I just measure the body consistently. That's the more important thing.
Yeah, no need to split hairs. Just be consistent with when you measure.
Yep.
Right.
And if you're looking at like your exact watt kg out on the bike and everything else, then yeah, you would probably want to change that. But in the end, it really doesn't matter as long as your measurement's consistent.
Again, I wouldn't split hairs even on that matter. I mean,
No,
you can be
your
packing
hydration
extra
status,
glycogen, your hydration could be up.
It's going to make a lot more difference. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, somebody says, a question for the end of the show, any chance of bringing Garmin or other Wi-Fi scale data into Trainer Road? It's something that we definitely are aware of, and it's something that, could be interesting. We've got a ton of really cool stuff right now, like the new PC and Mac app, or I should say Windows and Mac app. PC is like old person talk now.
No, you're going back to the hot or not stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Windows and Mac app. The new iOS and Android app is something that we're actively working on right now. We're working on getting workouts on the Wahoo head units. We're working with them. You can get them on Garmin head units, and we have so many other things that we're working on. We need more humans. You can see that at trainerroad.com/jobs. So we're constantly growing in that regard. Let's see. Another question. People are pointing out the fact that they're going to get cancer either way with the sunscreen stuff. Yeah.
That's actually another deep dive we're going to do later on.
Yep.
On,
really interesting.
DNA mutation and all the ways we as athletes are doing our best to prevent it, whether we recognize it or not.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. It's a great point.
A little more inspiring than the coffee discussion?
Far more.
Exactly. And then we'll just do a couple more. And if you are with us right now, you can throw in some more questions. If you have just a few, we have a ton of them, and I kind of had to scan through. But the other thing, somebody says, if you're watching this video, give it thumbs up. And yes, I entirely agree, because that helps. More people are going to see this video if you do that and listen to this podcast, that whole thing. More people will be faster. That's all the good sort of stuff. So somebody asked, just for a reiteration, if they're taking multivitamins in the morning with their coffee, Chad, how long should they wait between the two?
An hour seems to be the consensus. Is the consensus. It was stated outright in a couple of the different studies and in the conclusion of the review.
Yep.
That's so interesting.
Somebody also asked what a slow burn or sprint means. And I guess, how would you define something like that, Chad? Like a slow burn sprint rather than just like a crack off? The way that I would explain it is, actually, if you watch Fabian Cancellara, he was really good at doing that.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of a freight train sprint. Get it up to a high speed and stay there.
Yeah, it's not like if your peak power is 1,500 watts, you don't hit 1,500 watts, then drop straight down with a slow burn sprint. You might, pick up from 500 up to 900 or up to 700, and then you just hold 900 or maybe even 1,100 for quite a while.
Right.
It's
just
a different.
Think the difference between a 300-meter sprint and a 100-meter sprint.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. A lot, and they can be really hard to hold on to. It doesn't have to
so
snap.
painful.
You watch
like
people
doing
explode.
A kilo effort.
They go 300 out and they reach 100 and they just start going backwards because. And you hear the commentators saying it too. It's like, I think he went too early. I think he went. He went too early.
He went too early. It's always clear when that happens. So thanks for joining us, everybody. And we are going to. So first of all, go to forum.trainerroad.com to check out more from this episode. Producer Tucker's been putting links in there and taking care of all of that. And if you enjoy this podcast, please share it with people and check out what we do at Trainer Road. We promise it'll make you faster. We genuinely have a guarantee on that. If not, we give you your money back. So, and on the other side of things, for podcast listeners, we're going to have a unique schedule for the next 2 weeks. So Monday, we are going to be live at 2 p.m. Pacific, and we are going to have Andy Blow from Precision Hydration on, and we're going to talk about hydration stuff, all things hydration. So that'll be Nate and I with him. And then we will be doing a podcast in San Francisco next Friday at Strava, but I believe it's not open to the public. Stay tuned to the forum for any changes on that. But we're going to be doing it with Kelly Starrett, which is pretty cool, which now, not from Mobility WOD, they've changed the name to The Ready State. I like that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, and he's an author on mobility and a knowledge source and authority on mobility in general for athletics. But he has a ton of specific experience working with cyclists. So that'll be fascinating.
Athletes of all types. Amazing resource.
Yeah, fantastic. Very, very, very good resource there. So we'll be doing that one, and that one will actually be posted after the fact because we're trying to work out live stuff, and it may be live, but it'll likely be posted after the fact. So stay tuned for that. That'll be the following week. And if you have any questions for them, just let us know. Go to forum.trainerroad.com. Appreciate it, everybody. Thanks, Amber, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super fun.
Of course. And we'll see y'all next week.